Almost as soon as Elvis got back to Memphis, he resumed the hectic pace of his film career. GI Blues was up first, and began traveling back and forth to Los Angeles. When he was in town, he still had people up to Graceland, but the get-togethers didn't have the easy spirit of pre-Army times. I'm sure a part of this was due to the fact that Elvis's mother was gone, and it just wasn't easy for him to have the same carefree feeling around the house. But there was a different kind of shift in the atmosphere, too. There was still the basic excitement of being at Elvis's house, but there was a new intensity, too. Instead of just leading a pool game, Elvis might read to us from some of the books he'd read about karate, impressing upon us the fact that it was a mental and spiritual pursuit, as well as a system of self-defense. And instead of the sounds of a jukebox, it became more common to hear the sounds of practice boards snapping with the impact of karate kicks and punches. It almost felt like the discipline of Elvis's army training was carrying over to Graceland. But there were still wild nights at the fairgrounds or the Rainbow, and a lot of movie nights at the Memphian. And on those nights I got familiar with a few new faces that had been welcomed into the circle. There was one fellow from Chicago named Joe Esposito, a close Army buddy whom Elvis had convinced to come back with him to Memphis. And there were some new Memphis guys, Richard Davis and Jimmy Kingsley and Ray Chief Sitton. And Red West's cousin, Sonny West, had become a part of things too. Some of these guys traveled with Elvis when he made his trips to L.A., and most had developed a mix of friendship and working relationship with Elvis. When Elvis took these guys to Las Vegas for a weekend break during the making of GI Blues, the group strutted around town in dark suits and dark shades, looking like Graceland's answer to the Rat Pack. The local press dubbed Elvis's entourage the Memphis Mafia. The name stuck. As far as I could tell, there weren't any official jobs or duties for the Memphis Mafia guys. They just knew what had to be taken care of, though it did become clear pretty quickly that Joe Esposito was going to be in the role of right-hand man. There was one more new face that actually did manage to bring back some moments of carefree fun to Graceland. Scatter, a pet chimpanzee that Elvis had brought into the house. Scatter lived in style in an air-conditioned converted laundry room downstairs at Graceland, and he and Elvis would play around together like they were best buddies. But what I remember most about Scatter is his forward manner with women. When there were mixed parties at Graceland now, most of us guys were on our best behavior, but Scatter thought nothing of darting around the room and looking up girls' skirts. Surrounded by old and new friends, Elvis could still be the same exciting, mischievous, unpredictable, and fun-loving, though moody, guy to hang around with. But there was something different about Elvis, too. He wasn't so much a young rebel anymore, but very much a man. He was still only 25, but you could now sense a maturity quite a bit beyond his years. And that maturity translated into the way he presented himself as a performer. When he came back, the first thing he did was the Frank Sinatra TV show. And watching Elvis come out in a tux and sing with Sinatra, you couldn't help but notice that this wasn't quite the same guy who had gotten the pundits and preachers upset by shaking his hips on Ed Sullivan's show. Over the course of his first year back, attitudes toward him seemed to shift as well. Even the die-hard Elvis detractors seemed to accept the fact that this supposedly antisocial force had gone into the Army without a complaint and happily served his country. Maybe proudly is a better word than happily. I happen to know that Elvis hated being away and would have much preferred 2 years of performing on stage to 2 years of sitting in a Jeep. I witnessed the changes in Elvis and his fans firsthand at a big charity show he did in Memphis at the good old Ellis Auditorium in early 1961, his first big post-Army concert. This show didn't have the feeling of any gathering of underground rock and rollers or squealing teeny boppers. This was a packed house of respectable Middle America Memphians. In fact, the Tennessee governor and Memphis mayor had declared Saturday Elvis Presley Day, a pretty big endorsement for a guy who had once been considered the worst possible influence on America's youth. The show was great, and Elvis was still a phenomenal talent to watch in action, but what I remember most from that show is the moment he first walked out on stage. This was a very different walk from the one I'd seen on the Dorsey Brothers TV show. There was a little less slouch and a little more strut. Before the Army, Elvis was the loose, shoulder-rolling James Dean kind of guy. Now he took the stage more like John Wayne. By the end of high school, I had felt ready and eager to move toward some of my own goals. While I always enjoyed the time I got to spend around Elvis, it also seemed pretty obvious to me that he was going to keep living his amazing life on his own terms, and I had to think about living a life of my own. Kids from North Memphis weren't naturally expected to go to college, but my daddy, a guy who'd never gotten past the 8th grade, was very encouraging about my getting a higher education. And though my brother and I didn't always have the easiest relationship, Billy Ray also gave me a push and made sure I got out applications on time and pursued football scholarships through the proper channels. To be honest, I think Billy Ray was more than a little surprised at how well little brother had ended up doing in high school, and didn't want to see him go from class president and all-Memphis wide receiver to gas-pumping grease monkey at the Texaco station on Breedlove. With Billy Ray's help, I managed to line up a couple of scholarships to play ball at either Southwestern University or Arkansas State College. And after a bit of a false start at Southwestern, I ended up at the AS campus in Jonesboro, Arkansas, a dry little college town about 70 miles outside of Memphis. I was redshirted my first year and had a good season working out with the team as a wide receiver, really learning the subtleties of the game from my sharp-eyed backfield coach, Larry Lacewell. When the football season was over, I headed back to Memphis just about every weekend, but I spent very little time at home. I was either hanging out with Elvis, if he was around, or spending time at Carol Cook's house. She and I hadn't done much more than dance, hold hands, and neck a bit, but we considered ours to be a very serious relationship. Though Memphis was only 70 miles away, the trip in my '49 Dodge sometimes took most of a day. I had to stop 4 or 5 times to add oil to the engine, and I started driving around with a case of oil in the trunk at all times. Early on in my freshman year, I began to aim toward a major in history and a minor in education, and I did as well in the college classes as I had done toward the end of high school. Not being around on the weekends, I didn't make too many close friends on campus, but through football I did strike up a friendship with a guy from Philadelphia named Rick Husky. Rick was a big sports fan and was always around at football practices, which is where we met. We hit it off pretty quickly, and I soon discovered that Rick was a big music fan, too. On the weekends that I didn't go back to Memphis, Rick and I would go out searching for some cool music to listen to. I can distinctly remember driving to Truman, Arkansas to see Charlie Rich play in a club so small and informal that Charlie was using a Coca-Cola crate for a piano bench. Rick also happened to be president of the Tau Kappa Epsilon fraternity on campus, and before long he had me pledged into the frat as his little brother. A lot of the stuff that went on at the frat house struck me as pretty silly. After years of hanging out with Elvis, scavenger hunts and chug-a-lugs didn't seem all that exciting. But Rick's room was this big, dark space at the back of the house that he had decorated with large, colorful neon bar signs for Schlitz and Pabst Blue Ribbon beer. When those neon lights were the only light in the room and the right record was on in there, it felt a little more like what I had been used to in the TV room at Graceland. As it turned out, in becoming Rick's brother, I was becoming Elvis's brother, too. At the beginning of the school year, Rick had sent a letter to Elvis asking him to become an honorary brother in TKE. To everyone's surprise, Elvis accepted. I would come to learn later that one of Elvis's great regrets was his lack of higher education, and he was sincerely touched by the frat's offer. Elvis even invited Rick and some TKE brothers to Graceland so that he could receive a ceremonial plaque from them. Later on, we 3 brothers, Rick, Elvis, and I, would spend a lot more time together in Los Angeles. My football dreams ended in my sophomore year when, After running too many button-hook patterns and taking too many direct hits from oversized linebackers, my back started to give out. After having to crawl off the field during one practice and barely making it to the locker room, I realized I just wasn't going to make it through the season. The trouble was, if I wasn't going to play ball, the school wanted to cut my scholarship in half. That didn't strike me as fair. I had played as hard as I could and had been willing to offer up my spine in the name of school spirit. So I quit Arkansas State, moved back to Memphis, transferred my units to Memphis State, and got a job at the Midtown Sears. My Aunt Dot worked there, and I think she put in the good word for me. I'd get my education, stay closer to Carol Cook, and be able to hang out more with Elvis and the guys. I was increasingly convinced that Carol Cook and I had a future together, but a couple of times it seemed like having both Elvis and Carol in my life was going to be a problem. By 1962, Elvis was having some larger parties up at Graceland again, and I was very happy to show up at one with Carol on my arm. I figured that bringing a sweet, smart, beautiful girl up to the house was a good move. This was one of the gazebo nights when people were hanging outside and playing a lot of music. Carol thought the place and the people were just as special as I did, and that made me love her even more. We were both in a great mood and started dancing together. Carol was a wild dancer, and I don't think there was a guy there who didn't notice the way this lovely girl was moving to the music. And as her proud date, I'm sure I was probably looking very pleased with myself. Around the dance floor, we saw nothing but smiles shining out at us. What we didn't see was Elvis. Elvis was a star, but he was a flesh-and-blood male who had a jealous streak and suffered bouts of insecurity just like any other guy. This was his party, and if there was going to be a girl there that was going to get the attention, it had better be Elvis's girl, not Jerry Schilling's. The sight of my knockout date as the center of attention at his party, that didn't make Elvis happy. When Carol and I took a break, and I noticed that Elvis wasn't around, I approached Alan Fortas. He told me Elvis was inside the house, and when I asked if I could bring Carol in to say hello, Alan shook his head. "I don't think that's a good idea, Jerry." "Why not?" "Well, there was something he said before he left." "What, Alan?" He said, who the hell does Jerry Schilling think he is bringing that chick up here?" Suddenly, I didn't feel like dancing much anymore. I didn't see Elvis the rest of the night, and for a tense week or so, I didn't call the house or show up at the Graceland gates again. Then I got a call from Alan. Elvis wanted to get a football game together, and he wanted me to be there. I was still in, though apparently Elvis preferred to see me in cleats rather than dancing shoes. There was one other interesting Elvis-Carol Cook incident when we were invited as a couple to Elvis's private New Year's Eve party at the end of 1962 to be held at the Manhattan Club, a small, out-of-the-way night spot down on Highway 51 near Graceland. Elvis wanted some great music for everybody to enjoy, so we lined up Carla Thomas, Rufus's daughter, who'd had a big hit with Gee Whiz, Look at His Eyes. Also on the bill was Sir Isaac and the Doodads, led by a muscular keyboard player named Isaac Hayes. All the familiar faces were there, including Elvis's serious new love interest, a striking young girl named Priscilla Beaulieu. Priscilla was the daughter of an Air Force officer, and Elvis had met her when he was stationed over in Germany. They had stayed in touch over the next couple of years, and that summer of 1962, Elvis had flown her from Germany for a 2-week visit in Los Angeles, where he had just finished filming Girls, Girls, Girls. Back in Memphis, Elvis hadn't talked much about Priscilla to us guys, but his feelings about her must have been pretty clear to some. By the end of the summer, Anita Wood, who had been living at Graceland, moved out and announced to the local press that she and Elvis had broken up. Now, Priscilla had come to Memphis for the first time, and she'd been a presence at some of the usual gatherings in the week around Christmas. She had watched us knock each other off our skates at the Rainbow, and she was right there beside Elvis when we got together for a private movie screening at the Memphian or Malco theaters. She was only 16, but there was a seriousness about her that made her seem older. Watching the way Elvis treated her, it was clear that he was in love, and one of the great images I have of that night is the sight of Elvis and Priscilla dancing. It was one of the few times I ever saw Elvis dance when not on a stage. But the image that had the more powerful effect on me that night was the sight of Carol dancing with other guys. Now it was my turn to be jealous, and my jealous streak, helped along by one of my first ever nights of excessive alcohol consumption, got the better of me. Carol and I had a blowout argument, and I got worked up enough that I stormed to the back of the club and hit one of the side walls with all the charging linebacker force I could muster. Then I went home to my daddy's house and celebrated the new year by suffering through my first ever hangover. The phone rang the evening of New Year's Day. I was hoping it might be Carol Cook begging forgiveness. Instead, it was Alan Fortas. "Hey, Jerry, how you doing?" "Okay, why?" "I just wanted to let you know, that wall you hit last night?" "Oh, yeah, sorry about that. I lost control of myself." "Why?" "Well, it's just that there's a liquor store on the other side of that wall. When you hit it, a whole shelf of bottles fell over. Elvis paid for the lost liquor, but he wanted me to check up on you." I felt young and stupid and about as embarrassed as I'd ever been. But as I fought my way through the fog of that hangover, I was comforted by one thought. Who else but a real friend would cover for you when you broke a wall's worth of liquor bottles? I was making money for tuition working in the order-filling department at Sears, a job in which I prowled about the top floors of the store, receiving customers' order slips from the floors below through a system of pneumatic tubes. Once the order was fired up to me, I ran around to find the requested item, which I would then slide down to the appropriate department by way of a system of chutes. For a low-tech system, it was pretty darn cool. There was one other guy manning the tubes, chutes, and inventory with me, a very interesting fellow named George Gill. George was a small, wiry, highly intense guy with a head of bright red hair. Maybe having gotten used to all the characters around Elvis, I approached George with more of an open mind than he probably expected from an ex-jock, and we became fast friends. George was using his Sears paychecks to support a budding career as an artist and painter, and hearing the way he talked about painting got me excited about it, too. When George got word that he was actually going to have some of his work shown at a gallery up in New York City, he asked me to take a road trip up there with him. I said yes. It wasn't just George and art that made up my mind, though. Carol and I had made up after the New Year's Eve incident and had gotten serious enough again to start talking about getting married. Her parents, who had always been welcoming and loving toward me, drew the line there. The combination of my not being Jewish and my working-class background made me less than ideal son-in-law material. Carol was shipped up to New Rochelle, New York, to live with an older sister whose husband had a seat on the New York Stock Exchange. With visions of the big city in my head, Carol in my heart, George at my side, and a couple of $100 in my pocket, I boarded a New York-bound train in early 1964. The dollars didn't last long. When we got to the D.C. station and had a couple of hours before our transfer, I fell asleep on a bench and was promptly pickpocketed. But George and I did make it up there, and I consider the 6 months I spent in New York, the time when I was technically a college dropout, to be one of the most important periods of my education. George and I got a just barely livable one-room apartment on West 75th Street, and I got a job whistling for cabs as a doorman at the Carlisle Hotel and, later, as a reservations agent for Eastern Airlines. Just about every spare dollar I earned was spent on New York's public transportation system, specifically the trains to New Rochelle. Carol's sister, Connie, was not supposed to find out that I had followed Carol up north, so protocol was that I'd take the train up, walk to Connie's house, sneak around back, crawl through a basement window, and wait for Carol to sneak down to join me. We'd whisper and neck a bit until it was time for me to crawl out the window again and get back down to the city in time for work. More than once while I sat in that New Rochelle basement, Carol went out with some other guy, a decoy date, to keep her sister from suspecting anything. The fact that this plan made perfect sense to me at the time tells you how head over heels I was for this girl. A couple of times, Carol and I did manage to get out on the city together, and I was always impressed with her adventurous streak. One night, she insisted that we check out a Harlem nightclub she'd heard about called Small's Paradise. We got uptown and found the place, and maybe the door staff was a little surprised to see a young white couple up there, but we were welcomed right in. The place had an incredible vibe to it, a swinging, upscale hangout for what looked like the wealthiest and most beautiful of NYC's black elite. This wasn't like any Beale Street joint I'd been around, more like a black version of the nightclub at the top of the Peabody Hotel. More Quincy Jones than Rufus Thomas. I guess we didn't know enough to feel as out of place as we might have. We settled into a booth and got comfortable pretty quickly. We weren't drinking anything stronger than sodas, and when Carol asked for some extra cherries, she was presented with a beautiful dish of them that looked like something from a floral shop. She was surprised and excited to spot some models she recognized from the cover of Ebony magazine. I was surprised to hear that Carol read Ebony, but then again, one of the things that I loved about her was that I was always learning or experiencing something new when I was with her. We had a few great outings like that, and some nice times in the New Rochelle basement, but eventually, despite all our careful sneaking around, our forbidden love affair was discovered. Carol was immediately sent back to Memphis, and I stayed down on 75th Street. At first, I was consumed with heartache, but without any more commuter trains to catch, I really started to take in the city around me and open myself up to its pleasures. Concerts at Carnegie Hall, museums full of the works I'd seen in my freshman art class books, old-style steakhouses, and neighborhood coffee shops. Just walking the streets and riding the subway, I began to feel more alive, more present, and I dedicated myself to exploring what the city had to offer. I toured the UN building, sat in Central Park reading James Baldwin novels, and hung out in Washington Square Park, marveling at the beautiful children of the mixed-race couples strolling by. I picked up discount theater tickets to catch Richard Burton's performance as Hamlet. My spirits soared in Manhattan. Around me I saw opportunities for adventure and new ways to expand my perspective. The move to New York was a permanent one for George Gill, and I think it might have been for me, except for one factor that I couldn't quite dismiss: phone calls from Carol Cook. It took only a few of them, with her getting teary and both of us professing our love all over again, before New York, for all its wonders, just didn't feel right. Being in love wasn't quite the thrill it had started out as. I didn't want to climb through any more basement windows, but great theater and affordable steak were no match for a beautiful girl crying over a long-distance connection. Pretty soon, I had a ticket back to Memphis. Chapter 4. Welcome to My World. In the fall of 1964, the Beatles were revolutionizing rock and roll and starring in their own film, A Hard Day's Night. The American military had begun to drop bombs on some place called Vietnam. Cassius Clay had renamed himself Muhammad Ali and was riding high as the new heavyweight boxing champ. The first Ford Mustangs were burning rubber on roads all over the United States, and Dr. Strangelove was teaching moviegoers how to love the bomb and have a good laugh at the very idea of nuclear annihilation. Elvis was now a full-time movie star, and he had just had one of his biggest hits with Viva Las Vegas. Back home in Memphis, I was just about ready to embark on a future that seemed clear, straight, and utterly respectable. In between stints of shift work at a trucking company, a cotton gin, a chemical plant, and the new airport, I had taken as many classes as I could at Memphis State, and was now just a semester of student teaching away from launching myself into adult life as a qualified history teacher, potential football coach, and generally upstanding citizen. It was a good, solid plan for a good, solid future. And it was about to be tossed right out the window. When I got back to Memphis after my New York adventure, I moved into my daddy's house. He now had a place in Frazier, a part of town north of North Memphis. Because of my Eastern Airlines experience up north, it was easy to score a job with Eastern as a reservation agent at the brand new Memphis International Airport. On one of my first days on the job there, I served up a ticket to George Klein, who was heading to L.A. to meet up with Elvis on the set of his next film, Girl Happy. I distinctly remember saying to G.K., "Man, you've got the life. I wish I was going with you." Carol Cook and I saw a bit of each other, but things never really got back on track. Her calls had tipped the scales in my decision to come back to Memphis, but I'd grown a little tired of being the love-struck guy trailing after the girl, even a girl as exciting and attractive as Carol. I think we both began to realize that as much as we'd tried to convince ourselves that we were soulmates, we'd reached the end of our relationship. I started taking regular classes at the university and putting in graveyard shifts loading trucks. I also tried to find some of the excitement, and decent coffee, that I had experienced in New York, and I began to spend a fair amount of time at a brand-new combination coffeehouse art gallery in Midtown called the Bitter Lemon. The place was owned and managed by a wild-eyed, shaggy-haired artist named John McIntyre, who reigned as the central figure of bohemian life in Memphis. I liked going to the Bitter Lemon, and while I don't think there was ever much chance that I was going to go entirely beatnik, I was thrilled to learn that there was a vibrant underground culture blossoming in my hometown. The place was a stronghold of the budding folk scene, and I started to hear a new kind of music there from artists such as Odetta, Peter, Paul and Mary, Pete Seeger, and Phil Ochs. This was stuff in which the beat didn't matter as much as the message of uplift, hope, and togetherness. Hearing some of those aching voices and strummed guitars, I realized that some of the simplest music could be the most honest and the most powerful. Between classes, coffee, and work shifts, my only long stretches of free time were either late night or late night. Elvis hours. I'd check in with Alan Fortas or G.K. periodically, and when everybody was back in town, there might be get-togethers at the house. There were still some fairgrounds and rainbow nights, but if Elvis wasn't having people up at the house, it was more than likely he'd be at the Memphian Theater. One of Elvis's earliest supporters from the Memphis business community was a man named Mr. Schaefer, who owned the Memphian and ran the Mid-South Film Exchange. Out of that southern-bred respect for elders, even Elvis always called him Mr. Schaefer. The 35mm film prints for all the theaters in the mid-southern states came through that exchange, and Mr. Schaefer was always happy to lend any of them out to Elvis. He'd make sure that Elvis got the weekly catalog of everything that was coming through, and he even let Elvis have his own keys to the exchange, which was actually a huge warehouse in downtown Memphis. I'd been at the Memphian when Elvis had screened some of his own films, and I used to love watching him watch himself. Elvis, Red, Alan, and the rest of the guys would talk right through the picture, as if they were all sitting in a living room. The interesting thing was that they wouldn't talk about the story of the film, but would instead point out strange little details of the set, or the face of somebody in the background. "Hey, there's what's-his-name, the stuntman," or "Hey, there's that girl Red was after." They had all been together through the making of the film, and what I saw as a piece of entertainment, they saw as a strange kind of home movie. I thought that if I could ever be a part of those kinds of conversations, I would have made it to the innermost circle. On a typical movie night, Elvis would send a couple of his guys with the keys to the exchange, and they'd go in, call them up, and read titles off the giant film cans that were stacked up there in rows and rows. Elvis would look up the titles in the catalog, check the casts and plot summaries, and would eventually pick 5 or 6 films he wanted the guys to bring to the Memphian. He wouldn't watch that many in a night, but if something didn't grab him, he'd switch reels and start another. He'd watch anything and everything, as long as it was quality work. He had a great and broad curiosity about films, and could be just as happy with a crazy comedy as a heavyweight drama. By 1964, Elvis was already frustrated with the quality of his own films, and when I think back on some of the choices Elvis made for those Memphian nights, it's almost heartbreaking to think how sophisticated his tastes were. He was completely taken with the artistry of Lawrence of Arabia, and was moved by To Kill a Mockingbird. He really loved Rod Steiger's powerful and wrenching performance in The Pawnbroker, and was also impressed with that film's cutting-edge jazz score by Quincy Jones. There was one stretch during which Elvis had us watch Dr. Strangelove at least a dozen times. Me and the boys were probably not the most astute judges of political satire, but hearing Elvis bust up laughing, we'd start to see the film through his eyes and end up laughing just as hard. Even better on some of those nights was the impromptu after-show that Elvis would put on. He knew how to use that remarkable voice of his, not just as a singer, but as an expert mimic, and he'd do drop-dead impersonations of every part in the film. George C. Scott's General Buck Turgidson, Sterling Hayden's General Jack D. Ripper, and, of course, Peter Sellers's good Dr. Strangelove. Elvis was a huge Peter Sellers fan. He had every word and mannerism down, and it was always amazing to watch him. As a matter of fact, he did a masterful impression of Dr. Strangelove being choked by his own misbehaving prosthetic hand, an impression that he startled us with countless times over the years. I remember that Elvis used to impress me with what seemed like a bit of movie insider magic. We'd be sitting there watching a film, and he'd lean back and whisper, "Real change, Jerry." Sure enough, seconds later there'd be a little jump in a scene, or that telltale shift of sound and color that marked a real change. I thought maybe from his experiences in Hollywood he'd somehow become an expert at timing the projectionists, until one night he laughingly explained that there was a little blip in the corner of the screen that was a signal to the projectionist. I started seeing those blips on every film I watched in the theater, and even though Elvis had let me in on his secret, every so often he'd lean back and say, in an ultra-serious voice, "Real change, Jerry." On a late September night in that fall of '64, I was finishing up work at the trucking company, forklifting pallets of cargo onto tractor-trailers. By punch-out time, I was dead tired, but I got a jolt of energy as I drove past the Memphian. The theater was on my route to and from work, and since Elvis had been out of town for a couple of months, I'd gotten used to driving past the theater's empty parking lot late at night. But now the lot had some cars in it, chief among them Elvis's newest big dark Cadillac. I parked and went around to knock on the front glass. Somebody came and let me in, and when I walked into the theater, it looked like a movie had just ended. Elvis was down by one of the side entrances near the screen, talking to a group of people and apparently signing autographs for a friend of somebody. He looked as tired as I was feeling, so I figured I'd just slip back out, get my sleep, and try to hook up with him the next day. As I turned to go, I just about bumped into Richard Davis, one of the guys who had started hanging around with the Memphis crowd after Elvis got out of the Army, and who was now working for Elvis. "Hey, Jerry," said Richard, "I've got to take the films back to the exchange. You want to take the ride with me to take them back, and we can go out and get some breakfast?" I hadn't even had time to change out of my dirty work clothes. "I'd like to, Richard, but I'm a mess. Let's do it tomorrow." "Can't do it tomorrow, Jerry," said Richard. "Why not? We're going to California tomorrow." Richard wasn't Elvis, but he was very likable, fun to be around, and a good guy to have as a friend. You never saw Elvis standing at the gates of Graceland, or at the entrance to the Memphian, or the turnstiles to the fairgrounds. It was guys like Richard who checked with Elvis about who got in and who didn't, just like the guys guarding the velvet rope in front of some VIP nightclub. Suddenly, I wasn't so tired anymore. "Okay," I told Richard. "Let's get some breakfast." We had just finished getting the films back on the right shelves at the exchange when the phone rang in the office over there. Richard answered. He talked a moment, then hung up and turned to me. "Elvis just called and told me he couldn't find Jerry Schilling. I told him you were here, and he said he wanted me to ask you if you'd come to the house." I liked hearing that Elvis himself had made a call to track me down. Of course I'd come to the house. I'd been to Graceland so many times before that morning, but I distinctly remembered driving through those grand gates and thinking that this was the first time I'd actually been personally summoned there. I quickly learned, though, that even an urgent summoning didn't mean there'd be an immediate meeting. I waited in the living room for a long, long time, watching the dawn start to break outside and wondering if perhaps Elvis had forgotten about calling for me. Richard had wandered off to tend to the cars and head off to bed, and I was just beginning to think that maybe I should head back home when Elvis and his father, Vernon, appeared at the top of the stairs and started slowly descending, a step at a time, arm in arm. Elvis was 29 years old at the time, and I knew him as a guy in absolute peak physical shape. So what I saw when I looked closely at him shocked me. He had an oxygen mask over his face and was taking deep hits from a small tank that trailed behind him. He seemed a little bit out of it, not just tired from a long night out, but truly, deeply exhausted. And it was the first time I'd ever seen him looking less than perfect, a sign of just how early there was trouble stemming from Elvis the man's attempts to live up to the demands of Elvis the superstar. When Elvis saw me from the stairs and took in the surprised expression on my face, he casually tugged the mask off, pocketed it, and said, "You know, Jerry, this California smog will get to you." As stunned as I was to see him looking worn down, I was equally surprised to see how he could snap himself out of it, how he could physically will the sparkle back into his eyes, even when he didn't feel it inside. He asked me to wait for him out on the front porch, so I stepped back outside and sat in one of the wrought iron chairs there. I looked out at the gentle, sloping hill of the property and watched the first few smudges of sunshine break through the gray sky of a Memphis morning. A few minutes later, Elvis came out the front door, now looking perfectly put together, and took a seat next to me. He ran a hand through his hair and kind of squinted at the sky over Graceland. "Might be a nice day coming." "Yeah, might be, Elvis." I knew he didn't call me here to talk about the weather. He looked a little lost in his thoughts for a moment. Then he leaned in and focused on me with a look that was about as serious as any I'd ever seen on him. "Jerry, I need you to come work for me." I was dumbfounded for a moment. Ever since I was a scrawny, lonely 12-year-old kid, this guy had been the epitome of everything I wanted to be. I'd wanted nothing more than to get closer to him, and I'd only dreamed that someday he might really need me for something. But after 10 years of those dreams, I'd stopped thinking there was any chance of them becoming a reality. "Work for you, Elvis?" I stammered a bit. "Yeah, things aren't working out with Jimmy and Joe right now. They're not going to be around here anymore. I need somebody. Should be you, Jerry." "Well, when, Elvis? When would you want me to start?" "We're leaving for California today, driving the bus back to Los Angeles. You ought to be with us." "Today?" "That's right, Jerry." A little bit of a smile crept across his face. "I need you on board, man." For maybe one full second, I thought about how silly it would be to turn my life upside down on the basis of a quick, early morning Graceland front porch conversation. How ridiculous it was to scuttle all the plans for my future that I'd put together so carefully. How absolutely crazy it seemed to forget about everything else in my life and simply jump on a bus with Elvis Presley. Maybe a second. Then I heard myself say, "Okay, Elvis, do I have time to pack a bag?" I was in a daze by the time I got back home, but I think I managed to throw a couple of pairs of pants and a few shirts in a suitcase. I know I did make calls to my employers to tell them I wouldn't be coming in. I called my student counselor at the university to apologize for the unscheduled break in my studies, and I had a short but heartfelt talk with my father. He had been deeply proud of my decision to put myself through college, and had been tremendously concerned about my academic career when I had taken the time off to go to New York. He worried that I was throwing all my education away without getting a degree. I insisted to him that whatever happened, wherever I ended up, I'd get back to school somehow and try to finish my studies. I didn't think too hard about where or when that might be. My main concern was getting back to Graceland before Elvis changed his mind about inviting me along. My dad still didn't warm up much to the idea of my hitting the road with Elvis, but he told me that he had confidence in me and just wanted to know that whatever I was doing was what I really wanted to be doing. He knew that my friendship with Elvis was real and that what was being offered to me was a very solid opportunity of sorts. He was concerned, but, as always, basically supportive of what I wanted to do. I headed back to Graceland, was waved through the gates by Uncle Vester, who didn't even stop to call up the house first. I don't know if he spotted the grin on my face, but I'd been waiting for years to be waved in like that. I drove up the hill and parked my car in the most out-of-the-way spot I could find around the side of the house. I'd worked my way up from the '49 Dodge to a little MG sports car, but it still didn't quite fit the ambiance Elvis was shooting for around Graceland. I went in through the screened-in porch in the back of the house. Years later, this room was converted into the jungle room. The house was absolutely quiet, and again it was hard to believe that the conversation with Elvis just a couple of hours before had taken place. I didn't want to walk around the house and disturb anybody who was trying to sleep, so I settled into one of the more comfortable wicker chairs on the porch, and though I felt charged up with energy and excitement, might have eventually dozed off for a while. A few hours later, the house was an entirely different place, buzzing and humming with activity. Richard Davis was running around with suitcases, taking care of Elvis's wardrobe. Billy Smith was moving almost as fast as he did on skates as he packed up audio and video equipment. Alan Hog Ears Fortis was running back and forth like the friendliest of linebackers, stalking up the 40-foot Dodge mobile home parked in front of the house. Marty Lacker, an acquaintance of George Klein's who also had a background in radio, had become the new right-hand man for Elvis and was very carefully going through a pile of papers. Mike Keaton, a guy who had been hired on by Elvis just a couple of weeks before, was carrying boxes around with a dead, serious expression on his face. Mike was a friendly, dependable guy, but that serious expression was about the only one you'd ever see on his face. The rest of the guys kidded around a lot, but a smile out of Mike was a rarity. Red West had been working steadily for Elvis, but was also getting film work on his own and was already out in L.A. The guys had varied personalities and temperaments, but each could generally be described as a Memphis boy. I had recently met one member of the inner circle who definitely did not fit that description. Larry Geller, a hairstylist from Jay Sebring's upscale Los Angeles salon who had recently begun cutting Elvis's hair. Larry wasn't a football and roller skates kind of guy. His main outside interest was in reading all he could on theories of spirituality. Apparently his discussions with Elvis during haircuts had gotten deep, and the two had bonded quickly. Larry had been out in Memphis for a while over the summer, but he and his family had just flown back to L.A. a few days before. The Memphis boys seemed pleased to see me in the house, and whether or not they knew I was now part of the team, they took it in stride. I was trying to figure out how to pitch in and help somebody when I heard that familiar voice right behind me. "Jerry, you ready for California?" With all his clout and all his stardom, Elvis still insisted on driving every mile of these Memphis to L.A. trips, and he had dressed up for this bon voyage in full trucker's regalia, leather gloves, leather jacket, Wild One-style motorcycle cap, and the kind of thin white scarf you saw on all the guys at the truck stop. He was almost certainly the coolest-looking long-haul driver in all of Memphis that morning. "I'm ready, Elvis." "Yeah, just wait until you live with these guys. They'll get your nerves in the dirt." There were a few laughs from the guys as they went about their work. I'd learned soon enough that one of the ways Elvis welcomed you into his inner circle was by needling and teasing. The teasing could sometimes have a mean edge to it, but it was also a guy's guy way of injecting some real camaraderie into what was a complicated living and working relationship between all of us. Near midnight, after hours of last-minute preparations, we were ready to pull out through the Graceland gates and hit the road. Elvis, myself, Mike Keaton, Billy Smith, and Marty Lacker were going to be riding in the Dodge mobile home. Richard Davis and Alan Fortas would follow in 2 cars, each pulling a trailer full of stuff Elvis wanted to bring to the house in California. With everything loaded up and engines revved, there was one final delay. Elvis took about another half an hour to say special private goodbyes to both Priscilla and Grandma, Vernon's mother. When those farewells were taken care of, our hard truckin' leader bounded onto the bus, took his place behind the wheel, and put that road monster into gear. We slowly pulled out, with the guys waving to the friends and family that had come to see them off. There was a crowd of fans outside the Graceland gates waving goodbye as well. I felt a rush of excitement as we passed those fans. They were waving to Elvis, and here I was, sitting right behind him on his California-bound mobile home. That excitement settled into a deeper sense of satisfaction just a couple of miles later, as Elvis helmed the vehicle over the Memphis-Arkansas Bridge across the Mississippi River. Crossing that first state line, I took a deep breath and thought about what was happening. Elvis's big ride was making its way toward L.A., and I was on it. Jerry, listen to this. We weren't too many miles into Arkansas when Elvis started playing a reel-to-reel tape player he'd had Billy Smith rig up at the front of the bus. He fiddled with the volume knob, and out of the small speakers boomed the unmistakable voice of Roy Orbison. For all of his long drives, Elvis would have one of the guys put together some tapes of his favorite music, and on this trip, Elvis wanted to listen to Roy over and over again. Damn, you hear that? Elvis's features softened as he listened. He looked unconcerned by anything else in the world but the music he was soaking up. Damn. He shook his head gently to the music. After all those years of tuning into Dewey Phillips's broadcasts, I could tell you what I liked based on how a particular piece of music made me feel, but I never really thought about what it was in the music itself that would create those feelings. I heard a basic beat, a catchy tune, and words that stuck in your head, but I didn't have much idea at all about the craft and artistry that could be packed into a 2.5-minute record. On this first night of the California trip, I was about to receive a musical education at the hands of Maestro Presley. The voice, man, the voice. You hear what he's doing? He's singing great, I offered. Elvis nodded. Yeah, man. He's singing great, but listen here. He turned the volume up a little higher. Listen to those high notes. Nobody else can do that. Most guys go up high like that, they back off the note, take it on softly, or they growl it out, blues it up, and cheat it a little. Roy takes it high and sings it stronger than he does in his natural voice, and keeps it clear as a bell. Nobody else does that. Amazing. I'd always liked Roy Orbison's music, without being a particularly avid fan. Now, through Elvis, I felt like I was hearing him for the first time. As the tape kept rolling, Elvis delighted in pointing out all the nuances of this music that he loved, the expert storytelling of Roy's lyrics, the fine, understated support of the backing band, the emotion behind every vocal delivery. And after a while, we were talking not just about Roy, but music in general, girls, family, sports, Memphis, anything 2 guys might talk about. This was the first time I'd ever had a chance to speak like this with Elvis. As our conversation started to kick into higher gear, however, it occurred to me that maybe I was making a bad impression with the other guys, monopolizing Elvis's time this way. But as I looked around the bus at Billy, Marty, and Mike, I didn't sense any resentment. In fact, I got the impression that these guys were sort of relieved. Billy and Marty had made this trip many times already and may well have felt all talked out. They actually seemed glad to have a new guy aboard who could go head-to-head with Elvis in conversation, not ever a task to be taken lightly, and keep the driver-in-chief happy. When Elvis was on, he was on all the way, and you had to give him full attention and keep up with him. I was eager and willing to do that, while Billy and Marty were just as happy to play cards, and Mike, the other new guy, seemed perfectly content to smoke cigarettes and quietly read his Bible. After about 200 miles on good old Route 66, Elvis pulled off at a truck stop. He parked a good distance from the gas pumps, where the truck stop lights shined out over an expanse of dusty gravel beyond the parking lot. He told Alan Fortis and a couple of the other guys to fill up the bus, check the oil, and buy coffee and donuts for anybody that needed them. Then he reached behind his seat for a football and nodded my way. "We got some business to take care of." We walked out by the lights, and he suddenly smacked at the ball and said, "Go long, man." I started out on the gravel at a tentative jog, apparently not running the pattern that my quarterback wanted. "Come on, run it out, Jack," Elvis shouted. I went into my full, all-Memphis open-field run, and when I was about 40 yards out into the middle of nowhere, Elvis reared back and fired one of his perfectly arced spiral bombs. I threw on the afterburners, adjusted my slant, and managed to get to the ball in time for an unpretty but successful completion. "That's what I'm talking about, Jack," said Elvis. I sent the ball back his way, and he reeled it in for a catch. Then he called me back to our truck stop line of scrimmage and gave me another pattern to run, and another, and another. Pretty soon he called Billy Smith over to run some defensive coverage. 45 minutes later, my legs were about to give. My elbows were scraped from a couple of tumbles. I was huffing like a freight train and sweating like a pig. After one final long ball, Elvis gave us the all-aboard signal to get back on the road. Making time to L.A. was clearly not a top priority for Elvis, though, because we drove less than an hour before he spotted one of his favorite mom-and-pop burger joints and pulled off again so that we could have a meal. Alan and Marty headed inside to buy food for the group, while Elvis and I wandered down a small, brushy trail off the side of the road. "You believe in coincidence, Jerry?" "I guess so, Elvis." "I don't think there's any such thing. What we call coincidence is just life coming together. Takes us by surprise sometimes." "Yeah, I suppose that's true. What makes you think about that?" "Well, if I'm not mistaken, you caught the first pass I threw you back in Guthrie Park. If you hadn't, maybe we wouldn't have played so much ball together. And if you hadn't caught the first pass I threw you just now, I might have sent you home. But it all worked out, didn't it?" It felt okay to laugh. I was catching on to Elvis's slightly wicked sense of humor. "We haven't gone too far yet, Elvis. You want to send me home, I'll walk it." He let loose a laugh this time. "You're a long way from home already, Jack. Ain't no walking back now." Our walks, talks, burger stops, and ball playing set the leisurely pace for the whole trip. From the first night, this slow approach to cross-country travel was allowing me more one-on-one time with Elvis than I'd thought possible. For the other guys, this mode of travel was clearly a source of frustration and annoyance. For them, the excitement wasn't in the drive, but in the destination, where girls, sunshine, and movie sets awaited. They would have preferred to make the Memphis to L.A. drive a 3- or 4-day trip. But for Elvis, road time was the only time now that he was completely free of demands and distractions, and he was never in a hurry. On this trip, he found enough reasons to stop that it was over a week before we reached Los Angeles. Occasionally we'd hear on a local radio station that there was an Elvis watch. Fans knew he was headed west to make another movie and knew he'd be on Route 66, but we managed to keep things very quiet and under the radar, eating on the bus, getting Elvis in and out of his motel rooms without any interactions he wasn't looking for. If the owners of the motels or burger stands or truck stops ever knew that Elvis Presley was sitting in a Dodge mobile home on their property, they were also smart enough to keep it quiet. They didn't want to lose the nice chunk of money that came their way several times a year with Presley caravan visits. We drove through the nights, with Elvis pulling over almost every time he spotted a truck stop that seemed a good spot for more work on our passing game. Then, no matter how many or how few miles we'd covered, just before each dawn, Elvis and Alan and Marty would decide on a suitable motel for us to crash in. Rooms would be selected and paid for in advance, and with Elvis still on the bus, we'd all work to set up his room just the way he wanted it. Elvis had learned early on in his travels that the blinds and shades on motel windows often didn't do a very good job of blocking out morning sun, so he'd come up with the idea of covering the windows with tinfoil to darken the room and allow him some uninterrupted sleep. We had an extensive supply of the stuff to cover up all the windows on the way to L.A., and that was always the first thing taken care of in Elvis's room. Then we'd cart in just about all his clothes, so that he'd have a full selection of wardrobe to pick from for the next night's drive. We'd also frequently set up some of his state-of-the-art videotape equipment. Even though the first home video players were just becoming available in 1964, Elvis had gotten a prototype machine through RCA, and he'd put together a just barely portable reel-to-reel videotape deck system that he could hook up in his motel room. He'd had the system put together at Graceland, where he had already accumulated a private library of favorite TV shows and a few films transferred to tape. At first, it seemed like a lot of trouble to cart this stuff around just so Elvis could watch something when we checked into a place after the regular TV stations had signed off, but I soon learned that within his small collection of tapes he had a few very special ones that one or two girlfriends had made for him. These weren't talked about openly, and nobody else in the group ever saw who or what was on these tapes. But at least we understood why this back-straining gear was an Elvis room priority. The odd schedule and off-hour sleeping arrangements were hard for me to get adjusted to at first, and it was just a day or two into the trip that one of the guys let me in on the secret of staying up all night: prescription dexedrine tablets. Elvis was using those to stay up and stay attentive behind the wheel, and would then often use prescription sleeping pills so that he could get his rest. Now, up until those first dexedrine tablets, I hadn't had any experience with drugs. My nickname around Graceland had been Mr. Milk, because I was seen as the clean-living jock who rarely took a drink of alcohol, and in fact, the couple of times that I'd overindulged in booze, I hated the temper and the foggy head that it gave me. But Elvis was a smart guy and was in great physical shape. Why wouldn't I take the same pills he was taking? I got into the same better living through chemistry rhythm, and pretty soon those football-tossing stops weren't just a fun way to stretch the legs. They were a required method for burning off all that amphetamine energy. And by the time we finally got to motel rooms in the morning, a sleeping pill started to feel entirely appropriate. Although it's quite clear to me now that the cycle of pills eventually took a toll on all of us, I still say I was playing the best football of my life on that trip, racing, diving, and rolling around those truck stops, fiercely proud of every scrape, cut, and bruise I got on the way to another end-zone reception. The first indication that a sleep cycle induced by pills could have a harsh downside for me came during our stop in Albuquerque, New Mexico, when we happened to check into a motel with a circular layout. After we all got Elvis checked in and taken care of, I was handed a key with a number on it. But no matter how hard I tried to concentrate and how many circles I walked, I could not find my room. I think I was about to just lie down in a hallway when Alan Fortas spotted me and walked me to the right one. I remember lying on that motel room bed, frightened by the fact that I seemed to have lost control of myself. But I must have eventually slumbered deeply enough to ease those fears away, because when I woke up later that day and peered out the window, the vista I took in looked amazing to me. Spread out in the distance, like some unbelievable postcard picture, were these huge, majestic New Mexico mountains. I'd never seen a more imposing or beautiful sight, and if heart-to-heart talks with Elvis Presley hadn't made it clear enough, these mountains slammed it home. I was truly living in another world now. I think Elvis was making a somewhat special effort on that trip to make me feel comfortable. He really did appreciate the fact that I was leaving work, school, home, and essentially everything I knew to become part of his crew. And on the home stretch of our drive, the talks with Elvis got both deeper and more relaxed. Elvis seemed to enjoy stretching the mental muscles as much as he enjoyed working out his throwing arm. I'd spent a lot of time around guys who thought the best way a book could be used was to prop up a wobbly table, but Elvis was a voracious reader, always thrilled to talk about whatever book he was in the middle of, and always eager to get started on the next one. Hearing him talk, hearing him work over topics from the most mundane questions of sports and girls to the meaning of life explorations of spirituality and philosophy, I felt I was getting the chance to give my own mental muscles a workout. It was fun to run a pass pattern for the guy, but it was even more satisfying to go head-to-head in a discussion or debate. At one of our last stops, somewhere out by Barstow, we'd gotten Elvis into his room and the rest of the guys had gone off to find some breakfast. Elvis wasn't eating much. He was just days away from having to be on the film set and was already trying to diet off any extra pounds he'd picked up from Memphis home cooking. And I wasn't eating anything. The Dexedrine and sleeping pills had virtually erased my appetite. Elvis would be at his trim fighting weight on the first day of shooting, but I ended up dropping 20 pounds off a frame that was pretty spare to start with. Elvis would keep looking at me, laughing, and asking, "What happened to that big guy I hired?" We usually left Elvis alone as soon as his room was set up. That was the way he wanted it. But this night, after the others had left, he flicked on the TV and told me to sit down with him. In that little motel room, with dawn not far off, Elvis and I just kept talking, like we'd been doing on the bus. We talked a lot about karate. He was still an eager and enthusiastic student of the sport, which at the time still seemed a highly unusual and mysterious discipline. I remembered that as we stretched out in that little room, Elvis started telling me about his admiration for the mix of spiritual philosophies and practical concepts behind karate, the significance of inner strength, the preciousness of the chi life force, the power of restraint, the secrets of using your opponent's force against him. He talked about the power of stillness and concentration and how he was able to apply that to his acting and his recording work. It was a serious talk for a while, but eventually things got looser, as they usually did. The talk of concentration got us talking about hunting, and pretty soon Elvis was sharing some of his field-tested secrets for snake hunting. You just let the snake slither right into the bullet. And before long he was sharing what he saw as some of the crucial differences between California girls and Memphis girls. I think we'd finally worked our way through to some laughing reminiscences of nights at the Rainbow Roller Rink in Memphis, when Elvis suddenly sat up on his bed and stared at the TV with a strange, intent expression. I looked over at the screen to see an image of a group of jet fighters climbing into the sky. It didn't look like a scene from a movie, and I guessed from the late hour that it might be the station's way of signing off. This was a little unusual. I'd stayed up late enough to see plenty of sign-offs in Memphis, and they generally consisted of footage of the flag and a playing of the national anthem. But there was no anthem now. Instead, the images of the soaring planes and sunlit skies were accompanied by a poem that I'd never heard before. But Elvis, after so many nights and so many motels, knew these strange words by heart, and he intoned them dramatically along with the voice from the TV. "Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth, and danced the skies on laughter-silvered wings. Sunward I've climbed and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-split clouds, and done 100 things." I thought at first he was doing this for another laugh, but as he went on I could tell that these words meant something to him. Through Elvis I really focused in on the words coming from the screen, and though I was hardly a poetry expert, I too began to pick up on their power. Elvis, exhibiting the very stillness and concentration he had just told me about, brought his voice down to a whisper as he got to the final lines of the poem. "And while with silent lifting mind I've trod the high untrespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand and touched the face of God. The image on the TV switched over to the classic Indian head logo, and a test tone began to come through the speaker. Elvis had his eyes closed and stayed quiet and still for a moment more. Then he looked over at me with a tired smile. "That's a pretty good way to call it a night." I had to agree. And I think it was as I left his room that night that I had my first Elvis epiphany. What I loved about him so much was no longer an image, but the real guy behind the image. The more I got to know him, the more he was turning out to be exactly the person I had hoped he would be. As an insecure 12-year-old, I suppose I'd created my own sort of fantasy about the Elvis I was friends with. But now, as a slightly more discerning 21-year-old, I was discovering that the real Elvis was an even better friend. 525 Perugia Way, Bel Air. Even the addresses in California seemed beautiful, so much more exotic and promising than any address I'd ever been around. And as we stood in front of the gorgeous, modern, white-walled home in the hills above Beverly Hills, crickets chirping, the scent of lemon in the air, you could have told me that I had traveled not just across country, but to some better planet, and I wouldn't have put up an argument. The house seemed to be a small, single-level structure from the street, but once you got in, the space opened and flowed down the hill. It was decorated in a style that was spare and elegant, like nothing I'd ever seen before. Graceland had the dignified, comfortable look of the Old South. This place couldn't be mistaken for anything but West Coast. To me, it looked like a whole new life. It looked like freedom. It was probably 2 a.m. on a mid-October morning. We had made it to L.A., and the guys, desperately tired after all those miles on the road, quickly worked through all their arrival tasks before heading off to various sleeping quarters. I think it was Marty who told me that I'd be sharing a room with Billy Smith, and for the first time since leaving Memphis, I felt a touch of disappointment. I didn't know Billy all that well, but I hadn't been all that fond of some of the cousins I had met back in Memphis, and I would have preferred to room with a guy I knew I could get along with, like Richard Davis. As it turned out, Billy was quiet, friendly, and accommodating, and even sharing close quarters, we never had a single cross word between us. I didn't feel the need to make friendly with a roommate that night, however. In fact, I didn't actually feel the need for a room at all. Everyone else seemed ready to crash hard in a familiar bed, but the house, the hills, and the air seemed so unfamiliar and intoxicating that even though the Dexedrine had worn off, I was far too buzzed with sheer adrenaline to even consider lying down. I walked the grounds several times, marveling at the beautiful swimming pool that seemed designed for Greek gods to splash in. I looked up at the stars over Bel Air, which in that crisp night air seemed to twinkle with the same sense of excitement that I was feeling. Eventually I settled down on a couch in a small TV room off the house's huge central circular den. The room was full of soft indirect lighting, subtle shades of green and red, and just sitting on the couch in there, I felt like I was already living inside a movie. Nobody had explicitly gone over any particular security measures for the Bel Air house with me, but I knew that keeping Elvis safe was part of my unofficial job, which is why I immediately tensed up when I heard the click of a key in the front door. The door creaked open and shut again, and I didn't hear any familiar voices. In fact, I heard nothing. Somebody, it seemed, was trying to be very quiet about coming in. I was about to get up and investigate when a shadowy figure crept right past the alcove my couch was set in, past the room's big TV, and over to the far wall. In the darkness, I could just about make out some long hair down this stranger's back, and I knew that Elvis had occasionally had trouble with fans, especially females, finding their way to his homes and acting crazy. Sure enough, this girl began knocking on the wall, looking for Elvis's bedroom. This was my moment to take action. "Miss?" I called out in a firm, sharp voice. The woman spun around and let loose a blood-curdling scream. And at that very moment, the wall behind her opened up to reveal Elvis. He flicked on the lights in the room. There was a huge smile on his face. The girl being there didn't seem to bother him at all. In fact, he seemed to know her. My eyes adjusted to the light. Now I recognized the girl, too. It was Anne Margaret. Elvis put an arm around her and grinned in my direction. "It's okay, Jerry. It's just ammo. She's not going to hurt anybody." Anne calmed down, collected herself, and giggled. Elvis and she stepped back into Elvis's bedroom, and the secret sliding wall entrance closed up again. When the shock wore off enough that I could move, I headed back outside to take another look at that pool and those stars. I had just met my first woman in California, and it was Anne Margaret. Yeah, I'm a long way from home. Just a few hours later, after some minimal sleep, I began my first proper day in Los Angeles. Alan Fortis, who took care of all of Elvis's cars and motorcycles, wanted to tune up the massive Harley-Davidson Elvis kept up in the Perugia Way garage. It hadn't been ridden for months and might sit for several more, but Alan wanted it to be ready whenever Elvis decided to go for a ride. Alan told me he was going to take it out himself for a long test ride and wanted to know if I wanted to come along. I did. I hopped on the back of the bike and we zoomed down the Bel Air hills out onto the Sunset Strip. Maybe it's just the haze of a romanticized memory, but I think it was on that first Harley ride that I fell in love with Los Angeles. The sunlight seemed brighter than any place I'd ever been to, the colors crisper, the people more attractive, and as much as I felt part of a vibrant and sophisticated city, I was also thrilled at the natural beauty of the place, the hills and canyons and ocean breezes. Alan and I toured for hours, eventually working our way down the PCH to the Santa Monica Civic Auditorium, where some kind of large-scale musical event was taking place. Alan had been invited down there by a friend of his, a tour manager, to check out something called the Teenage Music International Show, or TAMI, a massive multi-artist concert that was being filmed as a theatrical feature. The bill was made up of a mix of R&B acts and British and American pop and rock acts, including the Beach Boys, James Brown, Leslie Gore, Jan and Dean, Bo Diddley, the Supremes, Jerry and the Pacemakers, and many others. Alan and I didn't have much desire to go inside the auditorium, though. We were just checking out the scene before heading back to Perugia Way. After drifting around for a while, we found Alan's tour manager friend standing in front of a beat-up, rickety-looking bus. I remember it as a kind of converted school bus, quite a few comfort and style notches down from the Elvis Dodge mobile home. We had just made introductions all around and had started to chat when a scraggly group of odd-looking guys ran out the back of the auditorium and onto the bus. I offered a general hello as they passed, but didn't get a response from any of them, not even a nod. As I learned a few moments later, that was my not-so-chummy introduction to the Rolling Stones. We were back in Bel Air by sunset, and when I wandered into the small den where I'd sat the night before, I found Elvis and Anne Margaret on the same couch, joking around with a couple of the guys. I took the only remaining spot on the couch, on the other side of Anne. Right away, Elvis busted out laughing again. "Careful now, Jerry. We've got a dangerous intruder here." I laughed along with everybody else. I suppose I could have been embarrassed about the whole thing, but I was actually too nervous about sitting next to Anne Margaret to think of anything else. Hanging around with Elvis had come to feel completely natural, but being so close to this gorgeous red-headed actress threw me. I didn't see how it was humanly possible, but she was even more beautiful in person than she was in the movies. I poured myself a glass of water and proceeded to spill it all over myself every time I tried to take a sip. My hands were shaking so badly. Within a few days, I would understand the situation with Elvis and Anne. They had met on set while making Viva Las Vegas the year before, and had hit it off as kindred spirits almost immediately. Elvis called her Ammo for Ann Margaret Olson, and had been having her up at the house as much as their schedules would allow. You didn't have to be around them long to see that they brought out an energetic, fun-loving side of each other. Elvis started telling the story of The Intruder all over again, teasing me about how panicked I looked. He began laughing, and the more he laughed, the more she laughed. The more they both laughed, the more comfortable I started to feel sitting on that couch in Bel Air. Eventually, I started to laugh, too. In the past 24 hours of my life, I had scared the hell out of Ann Margaret, I'd been ignored by the Rolling Stones, and I'd made Elvis Presley laugh. Not bad for a Memphis kid's first day in California.
This is the end of the CD. The program continues on the next CD.
Chapter 5. Tales of Two Cities. I kept waking up to startlingly sunny California mornings, and I continued to feel like I was living in a dream. First of all, it was a little strange to be around Elvis and actually see mornings, or at least see them at the start of a day. Back in Memphis, Elvis was on his own distinctive nocturnal schedule, but in Los Angeles he was strictly disciplined about his duties in the movie-making process, and he was rarely even a minute late for the early call times we got during the week. 6-7 for 8, Marty Lacker or Alan Fortas would shout through the Perugia house at the end of a night, meaning a 6 a.m. wake-up time to leave the house by 7 so that Elvis could be in makeup by 8. Elvis Presley was never at his best when you woke him up at 6 in the morning, but the rest of us were pretty grouchy, too. Still, there was something exciting about all of us shuffling about at that unlikely early hour, getting ready for a day on a movie set on the Paramount lot. Elvis was beginning work on his 18th film in 9 years, a production called Tickle Me. And as we arrived for our first day of work, I remember thinking that I probably couldn't feel happier rolling through the gates of heaven than I did rolling through the famed Paramount archway in a limo with Elvis Presley. While heaven might have had more angels, Paramount seemed pretty close. Tickle Me was set on a female dude ranch, and as I stepped onto my first soundstage and got a look at the extras for the first day's shoot, I very quickly became aware of the fact that I had never seen so many drop-dead beautiful women collected in one place. I guess I felt a little like a wide-eyed kid from North Memphis, awed by my step into movieland. But in a strange way, despite the speed with which I'd thrown myself into this wild new world, I felt ready for anything. I was still on the shy side, willing to defer to those who were older or smarter than me, but I wasn't the kid at Guthrie Park anymore, feeling like my happiness depended entirely on the whims of some bigger boys. I had been a class president. I had taken my share of hits on a college football field. I had thrown myself at New York City and ended up not only surviving, but thriving. I had picked up some battle scars from falling in and out of love. And I had just spent a cross-country ride with Elvis. Everything around me was new, but of all my bouncing around as a kid, all my attempts to find my way in life, and all my Elvis adventures had taught me one thing. It was this: I could take care of myself. True, I couldn't sit on a couch next to Ann Margaret without spilling water on myself, but that didn't trouble me much, or at least not enough to give up my spot on the couch, or in the limo. Elvis was already extremely frustrated with the quality of his movies, and on top of that frustration, he was never in a good mood at the beginning of a film, when he had to spend a lot of time standing around for wardrobe fittings and publicity stills. For most of the other Elvis guys, movies had just become business as usual, and when they weren't carrying out specific duties for Elvis, they spent most of the time on set away from the action, playing cards. But I couldn't help approaching the world of movie-making with some fresh eyes and fresh energy, and I think Elvis appreciated having that around. It helped him laugh his way through some of the more tedious responsibilities of a leading man. I know Elvis seemed pleased when I was very impressed the first time I stepped into the dressing room that Paramount always had ready for him, a huge, well-appointed space with its own bar, makeup room, and dressing area, designed for Jerry Lewis when he and Dean Martin were the hottest of Paramount stars. I would have been happy to have it as an apartment. Elvis gave a grand wave around the room. "All this for little old me," he said with a shake of the head. "I guess they like you out here, Elvis," I answered. "Yeah, well, don't breathe too much of the air. They bring it in special for me from the mountains." I was just about ready to start holding my breath when he laughed. "Man, they'll tell you anything out here, Jerry." Elvis could tease me as much as he did the other guys, but it didn't escape my attention that in the weeks that followed, no matter how frustrated he got or how foul a mood might have been brewing, Elvis often went out of his way to give me a nod or a comment that would put me at ease in the new surroundings. Working as one of Elvis's guys, I got my first look into the inner workings of his career. On one of the first shoot days on the lot, I was walking down a darkened corridor that ran between the scenery flats and the exterior wall of one of the huge soundstage buildings when I became aware of a strange thumping ahead of me. I stopped in my tracks, squinted into the dim light before me, and realized that whatever was making the noise was coming straight toward me and fast. As I stared down the corridor, I saw a small, head-high dot of glowing orange appear and disappear, appear and disappear. The thumping continued, getting louder, and I began to hear a fair amount of shuffling along with the low chatter of subdued voices. A few more thumps, a few more orange glows, and I could just about make out the sizable shadow of a massive man holding a cane, puffing a cigar, and moving toward me at alarming speed. I didn't have to hear the name. Just like that first day at Guthrie when I knew Elvis was Elvis without having to be told, I knew exactly who was doing the thumping and the puffing. The Colonel was on the set. I found a place to step through the flats out of the corridor and watched as the imposing figure thundered by, followed by a bunch of younger, smaller guys desperately trying to both keep up and satisfactorily answer the Colonel's gruff queries. Colonel Tom Parker had been booking and then managing Elvis's career since the Louisiana hayride days back in 1955. To me, he had always been something of a mysterious figure. I occasionally heard his name, but he was certainly never around at football games or at Graceland. The Colonel had a strange business background that included work as a carnival barker, a dog catcher, a pet cemetery owner, and a booker and promoter on the Southern country music circuit. His rank was apparently the result of self-promotion rather than military promotion. But since he had taken Elvis on as a sole client, his deal-making had become legendary. The Colonel was behind the early TV appearances that had given Elvis a national profile, the top-dollar deals with the RCA record label, and the movie deals that had made Elvis one of the highest-paid performers in Hollywood. To the Colonel, it didn't matter much what ended up on screen. The challenge and the triumph was in wrangling the most lucrative contract he could for his star. I didn't know any of these business details at the time, but just watching him walk, I could see this much. The Colonel radiated power. Those who weren't aware of the Colonel's reputation might, for a moment, take him as some kind of clownish figure, with his tweed cap, out-of-style jackets and string ties, and trousers pulled high over his ample belly. But that moment had better not last long. As I would witness many times over the years, those who underestimated the Colonel always made a terrible mistake. What I saw on the lot was that, whether this guy was a real colonel or not, he was a powerful, commanding presence, and he had a pronounced effect on the dynamic of any situation he walked into. People have often called him a P.T. Barnum, but the character he always reminded me of was one from the world of drama, Big Daddy from Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. If the Colonel was in the room, everybody knew it. Of course, the same was true of Elvis, and watching him and the Colonel together was like watching a couple of forces of nature accommodate each other. Throughout Elvis's career, you never heard about him sitting down with accountants and teams of lawyers and business managers. Between the Colonel, Vernon, and the guys, everything got taken care of. Elvis deeply appreciated what the Colonel could do for him on a business level, but he didn't want the Colonel involved in his personal affairs at all. The idea of the Colonel as some kind of Southern Rasputin moving his boy around like a chess piece is a grossly inaccurate cartoon of their relationship. When Elvis and the Colonel were together that first day on the Tickle Me set, there was no hugging or backslapping, and no loose, happy chit-chat between them. The Colonel stopped his barreling around and carefully picked his moment to approach Elvis. There was a wary friendliness between them, some smiles, a bit of joking around, but for all the work they'd done together, and as closely aligned as they were, neither one seemed to let his guard down entirely. As I'd see again and again, Elvis and the Colonel entertained each other just enough to take care of whatever business was at hand. They were like a pair of high-tension lines, incredibly powerful when working together, but you hated to think what would happen if the lines crossed and started sparking. I assumed that as part of Elvis's team, and knowing how important the Colonel was, it was my duty to introduce myself to the man. On one of those first days, I walked straight up to him and said, "Hello, Colonel." His teeth might have clenched a little tighter on the cigar, but other than that, I got no response whatsoever. He just stared right through me with the coldest eyes I had ever encountered. Then he simply moved away to talk to whomever it was he deemed worthy of speaking to. I tried a few more times throughout the shoot to make my introduction, but my attempts at friendliness were always met with the same cold, piercingly empty stare. I gave up, and without any personal contact with the guy, started working up a pretty strong dislike for him. I'd spot him barreling off somewhere in that improbably fast manner of his, and a choice string of profanities would come to mind. Then one day I came around a corner and found the Colonel barreling toward me. Before I even had time to think ill of him, the Colonel's face lit up with a knowing smile, and he shouted out, "Good morning, Jerry." I stammered a hello back, and was surprised to find how happy I was to be recognized by someone I thought I was on my way to hating. Lesson number 1 from the Colonel: keep everybody around you off balance, and you stay in charge. You couldn't help but have a love-hate relationship with the Colonel, and you had to admit he was brilliant. I figured out quickly that it was very wise to understand that if you were stepping into Elvis's world, you were stepping into the Colonel's as well. I think probably anybody visiting a film set for the first time is struck by two things: how much waiting around there is, and how much hands-on labor is involved in every shot of a film. While the talent spends a lot of time in dressing rooms or trailers, the crew always has work to do. I found myself fascinated with the hands-on elements of filmmaking, and spent a lot of time watching the way lights got set up, the way camera moves were worked out, the way sound was handled, the way sets went up or came down. The craft that had to go into a film, regardless of that film's artistic merits, was very interesting to me, and I started to become a student of the process. I also quickly discovered that if you were one of Elvis's guys, everybody took time to talk to you. Cast, crew, cameramen, assistant directors. Elvis didn't have to demand that we be allowed on set. The Memphis Mafia were simply part of the deal, and I never sensed any resentment or distrust from others around us. In fact, I discovered that as one of Elvis's guys, there was a reputation to live up to. We needed to be sharp and responsible, and needed to get things done for Elvis before they were asked for. The crew appreciated the fact that we did everything we could to ensure that Elvis was always where he was supposed to be and ready to work. The Hollywood higher-ups may have been a little suspicious of our rough-around-the-edges Memphis ways, but the folks we dealt with day to day came to consider us important allies. I suppose we guys were simply following the cues from Elvis. He may have been disheartened over the way his film career was going, but he was always calm and professional on the set. He might let his temper flare in the privacy of the dressing room, but he never let cast, crew, or director see he was mad. I became pretty good at detecting a burn in his gaze that let us know he was very unhappy with something. These films were built entirely around Elvis, but he never acted like a spoiled, demanding superstar on the set. That's one of the reasons why the crews loved him so much, although many of them were equally enamored of the personal interest he took in them. It took Elvis only a few days on a set before he knew everybody's names, their hobbies, what was going on with their families. I think he always had a great connection with the crew on his sets because, in some ways, he never really stopped thinking of himself as a simple working man. He was always more comfortable kidding around with a grip or a carpenter than trying to make small talk with a studio lawyer. Throughout my years with Elvis, every time I saw him tap his creative abilities to take on some new kind of artistic challenge, I came away amazed again at the breadth of his talent. And standing around on that first movie set, it happened again. I'd seen him looking good on screen, but it was a revelation to see him do the work that got him up on screen. He was just such a natural, making it look like it was the easiest thing in the world to be at the center of a film. Even to my untrained eye, it was pretty clear that a film like Tickle Me wasn't giving Elvis the chance to do all he could. The script didn't give him much to work with, and the shooting schedule was pretty clearly set to favor cost containment over artistic excellence. But once in a while, there'd be a scene here or there where Elvis did some great stuff. Little stuff, like a perfectly timed comic expression, or a fitting throwaway line. And sometimes, despite the weakness of the script, he'd still be able to pull some real drama or nuanced emotion out of his lines. In his first few films, he comes across as a fine, developing method actor learning his craft, and while publicly he shied away from comparisons to James Dean, I know he would have relished the chance to prove himself worthy of those comparisons. We can't know what he was truly capable of, but certainly the guy had some solid acting ability, and the material rarely gave his talents a chance to shine. If the films had been as good as Elvis, they'd be remembered a lot differently these days. A week or so into the Tickle Me shooting schedule, I had a strange sort of Guthrie Park flashback when Red West turned up on the lot to stage a fight scene with Elvis. Red's uncredited role in the film was, aptly enough, Bully in the Saloon. I thought about some of the well-executed football plays the three of us had run as I watched Red and Elvis carefully choreograph the big brawl. It had never occurred to me that movie fights had to be worked out as precisely as dance numbers, and I was intrigued watching the two of them work. Red and Elvis had a great physical chemistry together. They knew how to read each other and how to move together and trusted each other enough to cut loose with confidence. Between takes, I noticed that Elvis, as a result of the all-out physical exertion, was flushed and sweaty. He drank a lot of water whenever he worked, and while he may not have had mountain air piped into his dressing room, he did insist on a ready supply of his favorite brand of bottled water, Mountain Valley Spring Water from Hot Springs National Park in Arkansas. I took it upon myself to make sure that between scenes he always had a fresh, cool bottle of water ready. Not only did that keep the star from getting thirsty, but it gave me a chance to talk some more with him. These on-set talks weren't quite as deep as some we'd had on the ride out. Most often we compared notes on which of the female dude ranchers were looking the prettiest that day. In Elvis's films, there was a strange inverse ratio between the quality of the scripts and the number of girls on the set. I guess the studio figured that if it wasn't paying for decent writing, the least it could do was fill the scenes with attractive extras. If Elvis had asked me to come to California to be his water boy, I would have turned him down. My experience with and without Elvis had given me confidence and pride, and as much as I loved the guy, I had no interest in a future as a servant. But he hadn't asked that. He had just asked me to come with him and to be a part of his team. I understood that my job vaguely had something to do with security. I was, after all, the ex-Golden Glover who, after Red, was probably the physically strongest of the bunch. But Elvis hadn't even been that explicit about my role. Working for Elvis meant that you were becoming not only a part of his support system, but a part of his circle of trusted friends. For better or worse, we were everything for him, his staff, his pals, and, in a personal guy-to-guy way, his peers. In that spirit, I had no trouble bringing the star his water. I didn't feel like the kid in the basement outside the Chickasaw Ballroom, mooning over the chance to bring Elvis a Pepsi. I was a friend, doing what I could for an overheated buddy. After one of the fight scenes, somebody in the crew commented that they liked a fight move Elvis had made, and he responded that it was based on a karate move. When they asked how much Elvis knew about karate, his eyes lit up. He squinted out at those of us standing on the other side of the lights and called to me. "Jerry, come here. Let's show these people something." We squared off and started going through some karate demonstrations, just like in the living room at Graceland, though by now I was quick enough to avoid any crotch kicks. We worked out hard, building up speed and force, until Elvis backed away and stood in a relaxed stance. "I taught him everything he knows, folks," he said to our small audience, "but not everything I know." He wheeled around, made a sudden lunge, and tried to clip me with an open hand, but I managed to block him away. The old North Memphis knife hand block," laughed Elvis. "He's learning." My new Los Angeles career included one responsibility that I didn't enjoy at all: grocery shopping with Marty Lacker. As foreman, Marty had decided that the Perugia Way housekeeper was spending too much on food, and figured Elvis could save $100 a week if we kept the pantry stocked ourselves. I highly doubted that Elvis cared much about getting a good deal on eggs and butter, but on some shoot days I'd get the signal from Marty and would soon find myself at a market, pushing a grocery cart down aisle after aisle. Back on the lot, the other guys were with Elvis, surrounded by attractive women in Western wear. I was in front of frozen foods, watching Marty Lacker hunt for a good price on bulk chicken legs. I managed not to hold a grocery grudge, though. When work was done on the lot, Elvis and all of us guys headed home to Perugia Way, where we became the unified membership of the world's most exclusive fraternity. The guys, Billy Smith, Alan Fortas, Richard Davis, Mike Keaton, Marty, Red, and sometimes a visiting George Klein or Lamar Fike, would all have a late family-style dinner around the big dining room table, with Elvis sitting at the head. I think at those dinner times, everybody there felt privileged to have a seat at the table, including Elvis. The vibe was a mix of rock and roll backstage, football locker room, and White House Situation Room, and you couldn't help but feel that by pulling up a chair you were part of something amazing. Some of the details of our responsibilities and arrangements got hashed out over dinner, but it was pretty rare for a meal to go by without a good laugh over something. And the best laugh was usually at the expense of one of us. Elvis loved to tease. The voice that could expertly mimic Peter Sellers and Dr. Strangelove could also perfectly imitate anybody around him, and he had a way of finding the one inflection or mannerism in your speech you didn't want anyone to focus on, and turn it into a whole routine. Of course, we enjoyed going right back at him. Everything was fair game for a well-delivered jibe. Elvis's neck, he thought it was too long. Lamar's weight, Alan's ears, my romantic inexperience, or the way Marty looked in the Fred Siegel black stretch pants that he insisted on squeezing into. There was a brutal honesty among us that was a real key to the relationship. And there were some plain old brutal backhands that figured in, too. Elvis loved to smack somebody when they least expected it, and he always expected that he'd get smacked right back. This was some highly charged male bonding, and you couldn't have gotten away with being a slow-on-the-uptake country bumpkin. These guys were fast with the cutting one-liners, and if you couldn't keep up, you probably didn't belong there. Lamar was so fast with his deadpan put-downs that sometimes it took even Elvis a minute to realize he'd been put down, and then he'd crack up. Billy Smith became an expert at timing his lines with a dash from the table. He was usually sitting within Elvis's smacking range. I tried to hold my own when I had to. Reminding the guys of Elvis's running style always worked, and otherwise kept out of the way as much as possible. Around the house we loved talking in movie lingo. All right, 1 hour lunch, 45 for crew, 30 for stand-ins. But away from the Paramount lot, we weren't really living what most would consider a Hollywood social life, and didn't go out on the town much. As at Graceland, Elvis and the guys had a small circle of female friends who they were comfortable hanging out with, and they'd come up to the house from time to time. There was Pat Perry, an L.A. teenager with a great sense of humor, who was accepted as one of the guys. And there were Bonnie, Sherry, and Alan's friend Sandy Hovey, all local girls who were equally comfortable being a part of things at the house. Living in Los Angeles might have been more of a culture shock if I'd come out on my own, but I really didn't have to get used to L.A., because we lived in our own little world around Elvis. For all our locker room-style bonding, Elvis ran a tight organization and wanted everything around him, house, cars, guys, to make a good appearance. We probably spent as much time keeping the place clean and washing the cars as we did partying. In fact, there was very little alcohol around Elvis, and the only drugs were the ones we still considered medicine, the stimulants and sleeping pills that helped keep everybody running on schedule. Maybe it sounds self-serving or naive, but in the days before rehab was an accepted part of a career path, we really didn't see how using drugs prescribed to us could hurt us. The film moved along very quickly, and while Tickle Me may not stand tall as a significant event in Elvis's life, I must admit that it brought about a significant change in mine. One of the beautiful women filling out the cast of the film was an actress named Paula Tyden, a spirited, gorgeous redhead who drove around town in a Cadillac convertible. Red West pointed her out to me on the set as an example of the kind of girl you just didn't see back in Memphis. I had to agree, and I was more than a little flustered when I found myself talking to Paula one day and realized that we had just made a date to get together. I would readily admit that Paula Tyden was out of my league, but if she wanted to see me, I wasn't going to fight it. She picked me up in her caddy on a Saturday night and took me out for dinner in Malibu. I was hoping for a stroll on the beach after dessert, but we skipped the stroll. We may have even skipped dessert, and ended up checked into a motel right on the beach. There, to the sound of crashing surf, I finally became experienced. And I have to say that it was every bit as pleasurable as I'd been warned by the nuns at Holy Names. I didn't have much time for any afterglow, however. When I got dropped off back at the Perugia house, Alan Fortis greeted me by saying, "Man, you really screwed up." "What are you talking about, Alan?" "You don't mess with Elvis's girl," he said. "I was out with Paula from the movie." "Who do you think he went out with last movie? That's big trouble, man." Alan was an easy-going guy who didn't get unnecessarily upset about anything, so to see him worked up got me extremely worried. I knew from all those Graceland parties that Elvis did not take kindly to anybody flirting with his girlfriends, and could only imagine how he'd feel about a guy who had slept with one. I started to think that maybe I'd managed to lose my old virginity and my new job in the same night. I found Elvis sitting by himself, reading in the den. I approached slowly, a little sheepishly. "Elvis?" He looked up, his expression cold, hard, dead serious. I knew right away that he knew where I'd been. I started talking away. I had no idea who she was. She didn't say anything. I would have never if I'd known. When I finished, Elvis furrowed his brow slightly, but kept his stare focused hard on me. "You talking about Paula Tyden?" "Yeah, Elvis, Paula. I didn't know." Elvis took a deep breath, let it out, and looked back down at his book. "That's all over, Jerry. Don't worry about it. She's a nice girl." He wasn't happy. No guy likes hearing about another guy fooling around with an old girlfriend, and in those matters, Elvis was very much like any other guy. But he knew I wasn't trying to sneak around him. There I was, coming to confess to him with my head hung down after the fact. He was going to let things slide this time. A wave of conflicted feelings came over me. Chief among them was relief. As intense and wonderful as the night with Paula had been, I certainly didn't want that sort of thing to mess up my friendship with Elvis. He stayed focused on his book, and after a moment I left the room quietly, realizing for the first time just how complicated the mix of professional and personal lives could be around Elvis. I did see Paula Tyden a few more times, though. Enough times to know that I really was in over my head with her. We parted as friends. By the end of November, the film was done, and we were getting ready to drive back to Memphis. On one of the days just before we left, a strange delivery was made to the Perugia Way house. A crumpled, twisted motorcycle. Some of the guys quickly recognized it as Sonny West's. Sonny and Elvis had had a blowout argument on one of the last films, and Sonny had left the group, moving in with a girlfriend in L.A. Looking at the wreck of a motorcycle, we were all worried about what might have happened to Sonny. Alan Fortas made some calls and found out that Sonny was alive, but very banged up, and recuperating over at the girlfriend's house. Whatever their disagreement had been, Elvis decided to put it behind them, and he sent Alan over to Sonny's place with money to help Sonny with any medical bills. The next day, Sonny turned up at Perugia Way, hobbling along on crutches, to thank Elvis personally. We had just finished loading up the Dodge mobile home and were about ready to hit the road when Elvis told Sonny to get in the Dodge and make the trip with us. Sonny looked very surprised and pointed out that he hadn't packed up any of his things. All he had with him was his clothes and his crutches. "We'll get you what you need along the way," said Elvis. Sonny climbed aboard. Back in Memphis that fall, I moved into a new home, Graceland. As with most things around Elvis, this change, a huge, amazing one for me, came with little fanfare. There was no heart-to-heart talk about making me a part of the family, no grand invitation into his home. As I recall, somewhere during the trip back, I mentioned to Alan Fortas that I'd be doing a lot of driving between my dad's house and Graceland. Alan shrugged and said, "I think Elvis wants you to stay at the house." Sure enough, at one of our last meal stops before crossing the Mississippi River, Elvis was talking to Marty Lacker, who had been living at Graceland in a converted garage, always referred to as the Annex. And at some point he turned to me and said, "Jerry, you'll get the room downstairs." That was it. I was living in the house. There are some bedrooms at Graceland that are off-limits to visitors nowadays, including Elvis's and mine, though for very different reasons. Elvis's upstairs bedroom is not part of any tour because it was a place he turned to for privacy, and it feels wrong even now to violate that. My room downstairs isn't part of any tour because, frankly, it just ain't much to look at. And it wasn't much to look at back then either. Down in the basement, off the TV room, and directly across from the bar, a door leads to what was really designed as a storage room, and what was sort of half converted to a bedroom when I moved in. There was, and still is, a white linoleum floor, walls that are white brick on one side and wood-paneled on the other, and a drop ceiling that can't quite hide some of the pipes running through the room. The flashiest bit of decor down there remains the tattered silver insulation that hangs from some of the heating ducts. I did get my own bathroom and a walk-in closet, which my few bits of wardrobe shared with the Graceland Christmas decorations. I soon discovered that when it snowed or rained, water found its way into my quarters, and stepping into my room often meant stepping over a sizable puddle of seepage. My first act of personalizing the place was to leave a plank by the door so that I could get over those puddles with reasonably dry feet. Just outside my door were gold records, stylishly mod sofas, and state-of-the-art TV and stereo equipment. Lying on my small twin bed, I stared up at water stains and a bare bulb light fixture. But the state of my furnishings didn't bother me a bit. I was living at Graceland, and for the first time in my life I really felt like I wasn't just staying somewhere. I felt like I was home. Up until I moved in, Graceland had always been a place of excitement for me, a fun place where something was always happening. But living there, I realized that the peacefulness I had felt out on the grounds was really a part of the home, too. I've never felt safer in my life than I did living at Graceland in that damp, bare-bulbed basement room. I felt like I was within a kind of loving fortress, and it was impossible to be worried too much about life in general now that I was inside the Graceland gates, still manned by Uncle Vester. Actually, you didn't see much of life in general when living at Graceland. Things stayed as tightly organized around Elvis as they had out in Los Angeles. It wasn't like everybody went back to some kind of normal Memphis life. Marty and his family and I were in Graceland itself, but nobody else was too far away. Some guys had nearby houses. Some stayed in the Graceland apartments just across the street. Some in rooms at the Howard Johnsons just down Highway 51. The big difference was that in Los Angeles, making movies, the guys in the group all had a sense of what the day's working schedule would be. In Memphis, the workday centered entirely on Elvis, which meant that a couple of days might go by without anything happening at all, and then, just when you might be considering sneaking off for a ride or a visit somewhere, Elvis would need things done and the whole house would snap into action. I don't think I even saw my daddy, brother, or any family when I first got back to town. Graceland was where I was supposed to be, where I wanted to be, and it was far enough away from my old neighborhoods that I didn't cross paths with many familiar faces. We also went back to keeping Elvis hours in Memphis, and that made it very unlikely that we'd cross paths with anyone outside the circle. We generally slept through the day and were up and around when the rest of the city was asleep. Elvis didn't run his house like a tyrant, and he didn't lord over us like he was master of the house. On a day-to-day basis, we treated the house as our own. There might be a bad day when Elvis was in a dark mood and everybody walked on eggshells, but that wasn't the norm. He wanted us to treat Graceland as a home. You had to respect the place, but you could also be entirely comfortable there. It was understood that he was the one doing the work that made life at Graceland possible, and what he asked for in return for all that he shared with us was that we help and support him. If you thought of being with Elvis simply as a job, then maybe there were things to gripe about. But I thought of being with Elvis as simply being with Elvis. I couldn't have been happier, and it seemed like pure gravy that I got a paycheck, too. I've still got the stubs. $75 a week, $69 after taxes. My internal clock didn't always sync with Elvis time, so I was usually up before him or any of the other guys, and spent a lot of late morning hours just walking around the calm, beautiful grounds. I got in the habit of turning up in the kitchen around noon, where I'd sit at the little counter there and have my breakfast, while Vernon's mother, Minnie, at the other end of the counter near the red phone that called up to Elvis's room, tucked into her lunch. Grandma Presley was warm and welcoming to me from the start. In fact, I always addressed her as Grandma, and she always called me son. Gradually our talks moved from idle talk to something deeper and more special, and our meal together became an opportunity for shared confidences and commentary about all the goings-on in the house. I had come to Graceland as a friend of Elvis, but it meant a great deal to me that Grandma considered me a part of the family. Not all of the Presley family members were quite as easy to get along with. A few years later, Graceland also became home for Elvis's Aunt Delta, Vernon's sister, after her husband died. I don't think anybody who knew Delta would describe her as warm and welcoming. In fact, she was fairly nasty. And after a hit from her secret whiskey stash, she'd start cursing out anybody she laid eyes on, except Elvis, of course. Luckily, for some reason, she liked me too, and I didn't get cursed at nearly as much as some of the other guys. For all the luxurious trappings of Graceland, that little kitchen counter served as an important social hub of the house. Not only was that the spot for breakfast with Grandma, it was also where Elvis and the rest of us would gather at the very end of the night, when we got back from the movies or the roller rink. We'd sit on the kitchen stools, and Elvis would put his feet up on the counter. There'd be some quiet talk, going over the events of the day, and if we needed a final snack or a cool drink, we were tended to by Graceland's night shift maid, Pauline, one of the dearest and most beloved members of the Graceland staff. Pauline was black, but I heard Elvis say several times that he thought she looked a lot like his mother. At 4 or 5 in the morning, we'd call it a night and head from the humble counter back to our beds, while Pauline would continue cooking and cleaning for the coming day, always taking time to send us off with one of the sweetest smiles in Memphis. Just before Christmas of 1964, Elvis asked me to come with him and Marty for a ride across town. We drove to a small home in a working-class neighborhood in Midtown. This was the home of Gary Pepper, one of Elvis's earliest fans, who had become his first fan club president. When Elvis stepped off the train in Memphis after returning from Germany, the first person to greet him was Gary. Gary suffered from cerebral palsy and had a hard time communicating and getting around without a wheelchair, but he was a very bright guy, and for all the special care he required, in some ways he was taking care of his not very well-off family. Marty had let Elvis know that Gary needed a new wheelchair, and this trip was made to deliver the chair as a Christmas present. We knocked on the front door but got no answer. Elvis peeked through a window and then quickly walked into the home. The scene that greeted us when we stepped in behind Elvis was, to my eyes, nightmarish. Gary was crawling across the floor of the small living room. His father wasn't around, but his mother was, and she seemed to be completely out of it, in a trance-like state. Elvis immediately went right for Gary, got his arms around him, and helped get him up and comfortable. Gary was terribly embarrassed to be seen this way, but Elvis talked to him quietly and let him know it was okay. He was there to help him in any way he could. Once we had the new chair inside, Elvis lifted Gary into it and made sure it was adjusted correctly. I remember feeling weak. This scene was so awful, and I felt I wouldn't have known how to go about helping this poor, disabled young man. But Elvis didn't hesitate to put his hands on him and comfort him. To him, this was simply a friend who needed his help. Elvis was a Hollywood star and a rock and roll legend, but nothing seemed more important to him right then than lifting Gary Pepper into a new wheelchair. Christmas was a big deal at Graceland, and the guys were always concerned with finding a great gift for Elvis. That first holiday, we presented him with a fancy leather-bound Bible that had a sketch of the Tree of Life on its front page. Elvis's name was on the trunk of the tree, and each of the guys got their own branch. Written below the tree in English, Latin, and Hebrew was one of Elvis's favorite quotations, "And ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." In return, Elvis gave each of us a $1,000 bonus and a fancy jeweled wristwatch that had been made by Harry Levitch, a favorite Memphis jeweler who had been a very early supporter of Elvis's career. Mr. Levitch was also happy to do special work for Elvis, and these watches had an unusual face that could go black and then reveal either a cross or the Star of David. When I asked Elvis what it meant, he said, "To make you think." A couple of weeks later, the guys presented Elvis with a collective gift for his 30th birthday, a gold Tree of Life pendant, which became one of his most worn pieces of jewelry. I spent most of my Christmas bonus to purchase my first personal gift to Elvis, an intricately detailed collector's gun with a very unusual curved handle. At the time, it didn't strike me as strange to follow up a Bible and a Tree of Life with a firearm. Now I think it probably says a lot about the dynamics of the Memphis Mafia. Elvis didn't say much about the gun at first. It was always easier for him to be a gift giver than a gift receiver. But I was happy to see that on movie nights at the Memphian, he carried my present around in its leather case. In addition to my new watch, I had a connection to Elvis right in my wallet, an Elvis A. Presley American Express credit card, and an Elvis A. Presley Shell service station credit card. I was authorized to sign for both. If things looked like they were going to stay quiet, I often spent some time taking care of Elvis's small fleet of luxury cars. I'd get behind the wheel of a Rolls-Royce or a Lincoln Continental or a new Cadillac and take the car out to get washed and gassed up. There was a car wash just down the street from Graceland where the vehicles always got special treatment, and I loved just cruising down there, watching heads turn. Handling a Rolls was a much finer experience than piloting my old '49 Dodge, and I certainly didn't have to keep a case of oil ready in the trunk of the caddies. In fact, I now had a much finer ride to call my own. For personal trips, I was using the same white '56 Lincoln Continental that I'd seen Elvis leaning up against in Miami. Most of the other guys would turn up at the house around 5 or 6 p.m., and if things got busy, it was usually to work out the logistics for one of our usual activities, a football game, or a night at the Rainbow, the Memphian, or the fairgrounds. All those outings still held a thrill for me, but the nicest part of living at Graceland was the chance it offered to spend time with Elvis. In those days at the house, I think one of my greatest pleasures was simply the fact that moments with him didn't have to feel like special events anymore. We were close, we were friends, and it was the most normal thing in the world to spend time together. Yes, he was my boss, but I never called him that, and he didn't expect me to. I was proud to work for him, but the friendship was always more important than the business relationship. One day when I was down in my basement room, Elvis came through the door, a fairly rare occurrence, carefully stepped over my puddle, and in a low, quiet voice said, "Let's go for a ride." A few minutes later, Elvis was at the wheel of the latest Lincoln, and we were driving north on Highway 51. I had assumed Elvis wanted my company for some conversation, but he was quiet and intense, clearly not in a talking mood. A few miles down the road, we pulled off into the Forest Hill Cemetery, and Elvis expertly navigated the twists in the road to get to a spot he was familiar with, his mother's gravesite. He didn't say anything, and I stayed in the car for a moment while he got out and walked up the grassy, sloping hill to the massive monument marking the grave. It was maybe 8 feet high, a Christ with his arms outstretched, standing before a cross and flanked by angels, all atop a large, multi-tiered pedestal. Seeing him before that monument, it came to me that, perhaps, for the very first time, I could see my friend as a small, fragile human, just like any other. Despite everything else in his life, he was a guy who had lost his mother and missed her terribly. Elvis stood there for a while, and then, slowly, carefully, with his bare hands, he began to clean the grave, dusting the stone, brushing away some spiderwebs, clearing away some weeds at the base. His hands moved deliberately, with care and tenderness, and I found myself moved with sympathy for him, but I really had no way of understanding what he was feeling. I had been so young when I lost my mother that I had no idea of what exactly I'd lost. I had no memory of her, and only a single locket photograph. Watching Elvis act as a humble, loving son, I found myself wondering what that kind of love felt like. He got back in the car, and we rode back quietly to Graceland. Nothing was said, and nothing needed to be said. I went on a few of those rides to Forest Hill through the years, and I was with Elvis the day he went to the monument maker across from the cemetery to sketch out his own design that he wanted added to the stone, a design that included a Star of David, a crucifix, and the Bible quote, "Not my will, but thine be done." In all the years I knew Elvis, these trips were the only times I witnessed him openly demonstrating his feelings for his mother. As on that first trip, he never said a word about her. And perhaps he wanted me with him because I had lost a mother too. But we never talked about that either. Elvis's readings had taken a decidedly spiritual turn, a turn very much encouraged by the well-read and spiritually minded Larry Geller. Larry was still officially working as Elvis's hairstylist, but it was clear that Elvis valued the esoteric discussions he could have with Larry even more than he valued the haircuts, and while Larry still sometimes had some trouble mixing in with the Memphis guys, I found him a very interesting and likable personality. Elvis devoured the books Larry suggested to him, and then expanded his reading list to include works he discovered on his own. It wasn't unusual to sit up late at night with Elvis and hear him discuss the intricacies of books like Autobiography of a Yogi, Khalil Gibran's The Prophet, The Impersonal Life by Joseph Benner, or Cairo's Book of Numbers. Elvis hasn't ever gotten much credit as a thinker, but it was striking to me back then how much he struggled to make sense of the life he was blessed with, and how hungry he was for a sense of meaning and purpose. He hadn't had the opportunity for a formal education, so he'd sometimes head down a path that would turn out to be unsatisfactory or just too far out, but eventually he'd sense that happening, and with a little more education I think he might have understood better what he was looking for and how to look for it. Elvis was always a little embarrassed about his lack of formal education, and he was well aware that he was seen by many as a poor, dumb Southern country boy who had gotten lucky. But I have to say that I learned more from him in our late-night conversations than I ever learned from anybody else, and if I could get any moment back with him, I'd ask for one of those nights. He and I staying up late, chugging Mountain Valley water, and seeking out the meaning of life. Living at Graceland, it wasn't only Elvis that I got closer to. I also began to develop a much closer relationship with his father, Vernon, and with the young woman he had chosen to share his home and life with, Priscilla Beaulieu. A lot of the guys did not have warm feelings toward Vernon, primarily because of his perceived role as tight-fisted money handler and bearer of bad news. Elvis never wanted to be the bad guy. If someone was going to be fired, Vernon conveyed the message. There was also some resentment toward Vernon because of the perception that he didn't have the skills to match the supervisory position he was in around Elvis. But I don't think Vernon gets enough credit for rising to the occasion the way he did. He was a dirt-poor working man who suddenly found himself managing the personal affairs and finances of the world's biggest superstar. And he did a pretty good job of it. Given the spending habits of that superstar, I don't think a team of expert accountants could have done any better. Some of the guys joked that Vernon was just plain cheap, because if Elvis wanted something special for Graceland, Vernon's idea of going upscale was to shop at Sears. True, but understanding how he and his family had lived for so long with nothing and how hard they had worked, it made sense that he knew the value of $1. And it definitely helped to have Vernon watching the checkbook when Elvis went on a buying spree. Compared to some of the folks I'd known in North Memphis, Vernon struck me as being fairly sophisticated, always looking like a kind of poor man's Clark Gable. He wasn't really one of the guys, and never tried to be, but I always enjoyed talking with him in his office out behind Graceland. He had both a sense of calm and a dry, offbeat sense of humor, and I can picture him shuffling in from the office and coming through the kitchen, stopping over every pot to take a little taste, pinching up some greens here, some chicken there, and giving a little grunt that meant the meal was going to turn out all right. Priscilla Presley is one of my dearest friends today, but in the early days at Graceland our relationship was a distant one. It had to be because Elvis didn't really want the guys to be close friends with Priscilla, especially not a younger, single guy like me. He didn't want her to be considered one of the guys. She was to be respected as lady of the house. So even though I lived in the same house, I was a friend of Elvis's and knew Priscilla only as his girlfriend. As Priscilla has said, she and I were growing up together at Graceland, but at first there wasn't supposed to be much of a direct friendship between us. This was fine by me. After the Paula Tyden incident, I had no desire to test Elvis's jealous streak again. But I know the general situation was hard for Priscilla. In early 1963, she had left her family in Germany and come to Memphis to finish high school and to gradually become a full-time Graceland resident. Priscilla was shy, quiet, stunningly beautiful, and it was apparent that she and Elvis were deeply in love. But I know it wasn't easy for her to step into what had been essentially a bachelor's world. She was with the man she loved, in a house she could only have dreamed of, but I don't think her dreams would have ever included Jerry Schilling in the basement, Marty Lacker in the annex, and a football squad of strange guys coming and going at all hours of the day and night. Priscilla didn't fall in love with us. She fell in love with Elvis and wanted a life with him. On the guy's side, we had been used to Elvis's having girlfriends who had very little impact on the way things worked around him, but Priscilla was someone on a much different level, and it took some adjusting to on all sides. The delicacy of the situation became clear to Priscilla and me one night after an encounter in the Graceland kitchen. I was pouring myself a glass of milk when Priscilla walked in, and it was the first time I saw her not looking great. She looked like maybe she had the flu, eyes red and watery and face flushed. "Are you feeling okay, Priscilla?" I asked. "Yeah," she said weakly. "Are you sure?" "Yeah, I'm just tired." She went back upstairs, and I went out to the back room of the house. It seemed like that was that, except that now I became aware of some very loud voices upstairs. Priscilla did not have the flu. What I hadn't known in the kitchen was that Elvis and Priscilla were in the middle of a hellacious argument. They were both furious with each other over something, and Priscilla, after bursting into tears, had come downstairs just to take a breather. When she went back upstairs, the fight started all over again, and one of the first things she said to Elvis was, "At least Jerry Schilling cares about how I feel." This was not a good thing to say to an already angry Elvis. I took a seat in the back room of the house, joining a couple of the other guys there. The noises continued upstairs, but I became more focused on the football game the guys were watching on TV. All of a sudden, Elvis stormed into the room, so agitated he couldn't quite stand still. He stared down at the floor and announced to the group of us, "God damn it, I don't need anybody else taking care of Priscilla and checking how she is. Is that goddamn clear?" The other guys nodded, though they weren't quite sure what Elvis was talking about. But I knew exactly what he was talking about and who he was talking to. He didn't wait for any answer from anyone and just stormed back out of the room and up the stairs. No, I hadn't done anything wrong, but I didn't need to see Elvis that worked up again on my account. It was almost a full year before I had another conversation with Priscilla. Chapter 6. Paradise Found. In March of 1965, Elvis and us guys were back out in L.A., where he went to work making 3 films almost back-to-back, Harem Scarum, Frankie and Johnny, and Paradise, Hawaiian Style. The days on the lot and the nights at the Perugia house were similar to what I'd experienced during the Tickle Me shoot, but there was one significant roster change for us. Returning to the group and serving as a co-foreman with Marty was Joe Esposito. Joe was an Army buddy who had begun working for Elvis almost as soon as they were back from Germany, and whatever disagreement had caused them to part ways for a while seemed to be completely forgotten once Joe was back with Elvis and the guys. It quickly became apparent to me that Joe was a great asset to the group. He wasn't a Southern boy, but he fit right in with his mix of Chicago street smarts and an easygoing sense of humor. More importantly, Joe had a great knack for projecting calm while handling all the organizational tasks always swirling around Elvis and the group. And he had a very natural way of delegating responsibilities that left a minimum of ruffled feathers. Joe dependably took care of things and almost made it look easy. I could also see that as different as he and I were in background and temperament, Joe, too, shared a special, devoted friendship with Elvis. A few weeks into this L.A. trip, I met for the first time another long-running member of the Inner Circle. It was a quiet Saturday evening at the Perugia house, and I happened to be in the main den when I heard a loud knock at the door. It wasn't too often that a knock at that door was unexpected. We usually knew who was coming by and when. So this knock immediately put me into security mode. I opened the door, ready to turn away any overeager fan or unwanted visitor. "Who is it?" I asked the small, intense-looking figure before me. "Charlie Hodge," he answered, obviously a little upset that I didn't know him by sight. "Hang on, I'll check with Elvis." I had heard the name, and I knew Elvis and Charlie were close, but given Elvis's shifting moods and aversion to surprise guests, I was going to make sure Elvis was feeling up for a visitor. But as I turned to go find Elvis, Charlie shot right past me into the house, and obviously knew his way around well enough to dart around the corner into the little den where Elvis usually hung out. I was stunned, wondering what the security protocol was for a situation like this, but a second after the alleged Charlie Hodge disappeared, I heard Elvis call out in a happy voice, "Hey, Charlie!" That was my introduction to Mr. Hodge, an army buddy of Elvis's who also became a well-traveled member of the inner circle. Charlie was also deeply devoted to Elvis and, as I soon learned, functioned a bit like the court jester of the Memphis Mafia, quick with a gag and always a steady source of laughter. Through the years, he was also a key figure in supporting and encouraging Elvis's musical development. Not all Saturday evenings were quiet for the group, but more often than not, the L.A. house operated much in the manner of a Graceland West, with Elvis and the rest of us living in the same self-contained, self-reliant manner we did back east. We didn't mix with the neighbors, who included Dean Martin, Alfred Hitchcock, Jerry Lewis, and Howard Hughes. A future employer of mine, Brian Wilson, lived 2 blocks away on Bellagio. And there were very few Hollywood celebrities who were welcomed in. Bing's son, Gary Crosby, hung out with us a few times, and Ricky Nelson participated in some football games, but that was about it. But aside from the basic courtesy meetings, Elvis hardly spent any time with power players from the studios. It might seem strange that a star like Elvis would not become a toast of the town in L.A., but for all his success and the steady, profitable film work he was engaged in, Elvis always had a curious relationship with Hollywood. He was still Elvis out there, but I think he knew that he was Elvis based on what he'd done in the past, not what he was doing now. His movies weren't automatic hits anymore, and his years of hit records seemed farther away than ever. He was treated like royalty at every movie lot and recording studio, but it had to be agonizing for him that though he was potentially at the peak of his powers, he couldn't find a way to really flex his creative muscles. At 30, he sometimes felt he was being looked at more as a quaint bit of pop history than as a vital talent. He was given all due respect for past glories, but what had he done lately? Harem Holiday was no Heartbreak Hotel. He knew that as well as anyone. One thing that was true about Elvis throughout his life, he wasn't going to walk himself into any situation where he'd feel uncomfortable. And most of the Hollywood social scene made him uncomfortable, so he didn't go out on the town much and didn't make any attempt to crack into Hollywood social circles. This aspect of Elvis's life has earned him the reputation as a recluse, and living with Elvis there were certainly times when it felt like he was acting a bit like our neighbor, Mr. Hughes, but Elvis was a guy who had been dealing with uncomfortable situations since he was 19, putting up with authorities that denounced him, a huge segment of the public that despised him, and adoring crowds that wanted to lovingly rip him to pieces. I don't think his wanting to stay in was crazy. Given how much time he spent living his life in public, his desire for privacy was one of the most normal things about him. Throughout this time at the Perugia house, I could see that for all the fine trappings of the luxurious lifestyle Elvis had earned, there were pressures, burdens, and doubts that wore on him heavily. His success had given him a great life, but it was an extremely complicated one. He had started out as a kid who wanted to sing, and had turned into an industry. On one of the quiet days, he and I were in that little den off the side of the house by ourselves, just watching TV. At one point, he turned to me and said, "Jerry, you know the hardest thing you're ever going to have to learn?" "No, Elvis, what's that?" "How to not do anything." It took me years before I really understood that, but it's turned out to be one of the smartest things anybody's ever said to me. In my personal life and in my career, I've learned again and again that having nothing to do can be a lot harder than having something to do, and that living a dream isn't always as satisfying as having a dream. On the nights we stayed in at the Perugia house, we spent a lot of time around the pool table in the big round den with the open fireplace, and even more time hanging out in that little den. Elvis had become infatuated with playing a Fender electric bass guitar, and a lot of nights he'd plug in, sit in front of a TV with the sound turned down, and play along at extremely high volume with a stack of records. Elvis had learned very early on in his career that if he tried to plan any personal outings in advance, word would get out, he'd be mobbed, and what was supposed to be personal time would become a public appearance. So he got in the habit of making last-minute decisions to do whatever it was he wanted to do, a habit that fit very well with his temperament. Occasionally a buzz would ripple through the house, and we'd all snap into action like the White House staff and the Secret Service getting ready for a presidential excursion. We were going out. Elvis's club of choice in Los Angeles was the Red Velvet on Sunset Boulevard. The TV rock and roll show Shindig, which had recently debuted and was an instant hit, was taped nearby on Monday afternoons. Monday nights, guys from the house band, the Shin Dogs, and some of the artists that appeared on the show would head to the Red Velvet afterward. One of those Shin Dogs was a twangy guitar player named James Burton, later a member of Elvis's band. The Red Velvet had the feel of a hipster lounge, big red leather booths, low lights, a small stage, and a cool clientele. Elvis had become friendly with the owner of the club, Tony Farah, who was always happy to rope off a few booths and get the place ready for an Elvis entrance when he got word from a couple of us guys working as an advance team. The very first time I was part of a Red Velvet expedition, I was understandably excited and wanted to make the best impression possible. The guys had started making Saturday shopping trips to the Fred Siegel store to pick up clothes for ourselves and Elvis, and I put on what I thought was my best Siegel-bought stuff to go out. As I left my room to head toward the door, I passed Elvis, who was looking killer sharp in his black pants and tailored jacket with the collar up. He just glanced at me and said, "You better get ready, Jerry. We're going out." Obviously, I had not passed muster. I went back to my room, put on a different set of still pretty nice slacks and shirt, and headed out again. This time I met Elvis and some of the other guys by the front door. Elvis eyed me up and down. "Jerry, you gonna wear that? We're going to a club." Now I broke out in a nervous sweat. I couldn't figure out what I was doing wrong. I'd already picked up on some of Elvis's wardrobe tricks, like cutting out the pockets of pants to get a smoother, tighter fit. But apparently something about my fashion sense wasn't working. I ran back to the room, threw on my last possible going-out outfit, and ran back to the group. Now Elvis actually looked angry. "Would you stop messing around? You're going to wear that? Come on, man, it's a club, a Hollywood club." I must have looked red-faced and desperate enough that before I could ask what wardrobe mistake I was making, the whole group of guys cracked up. I had just been given a traditional Memphis Mafia hazing. Elvis came over to shoot an elbow at my ribs. My red face might have clashed with whatever I had on, but it didn't matter. I'd be riding with Elvis for a night on the town. At the Red Velvet, we mixed with members of acts like the Buffalo Springfield, the Righteous Brothers, and a Memphis trio called the Guillotines, who had scored both a Shindig appearance and a Phil Spector recording session. It's surprising how low-key it felt to be hanging out with some of the hottest names on the L.A. music scene at the time. I suppose I felt I was already with the biggest star in the room. Everybody else was just a nice guy to have a drink with. And I wasn't that interested in drinks with the guys. I had started taking out a very cute extra from Harem Scarum named Vicky, and she, along with some of the other guys' dates, would often come with us to the club. It seemed like a lot of the other musicians still considered Elvis to be the biggest star in the room. One time we were watching singer P.J. Proby perform his big hit, a cover of Somewhere from West Side Story. Elvis sent up a note to the stage asking him if he'd sing the song again. Proby, a polished professional, read the note, stopped dead, and sat down on the stage. After a moment he said to the crowd, "I've just received the biggest honor I could ever hope for, a personal request from Elvis Presley." Around our work and home schedules, I started making some outings of my own. Elvis was still passionately interested in explorations of spirituality and was constantly poring over his collection of books, marking them up and occasionally reading out sections to some of us. I got the feeling that some of the other guys saw this as the weird side of Elvis, something that just had to be put up with. Their attitude toward Elvis's books was no doubt colored by their strong antipathy toward Larry Geller, who was always much more of a California dude than a Memphis fella. But I was fascinated by the fact that Elvis was still curious and hungry for education, and that sharpened my own hunger for knowledge. So in the spring of 1965, I worked for Elvis by day and started taking classes at UCLA at night. Back in my high school football days, I had always nursed a dream of playing for USC, but working for Elvis, we drove through the UCLA campus in Westwood almost every day to get to our regular market, or pharmacy, or pizza place. I fell in love with that sprawling, stately campus and realized how much I actually missed being a student. So I signed up for some anthropology and history classes there to pick up my last credits toward a degree. While I didn't hear anything directly from the guys about my new nighttime activity, I'm sure they took it as evidence that I too was getting weird. Why would anybody in their right mind choose to go back to school? As it turned out, some nights I might have learned more by staying home. In one class, we were going to discuss something about the dynamics of social structure and the power of popular culture. I opened up my textbook, and there was a picture of Elvis. I had a brief temptation to shout out, "Hey, I just walked down the hill from this guy's house," but I kept quiet. I just couldn't believe I'd gone to the trouble of enrolling in a night class to study the guy I was spending all day with. It was one of the better discussions that semester, though. I think my long walks from Bel Air to UCLA influenced another independent decision I made, to become a motorcycle owner. I had always wanted to have my own bike, to see if I couldn't pull off a bit of that Brando and the Wild One mystique. A motorcycle seemed just the thing to make my California dream perfect and complete. So, despite my resistance to the idea of taking on debt, I went down one day to the Robertson Triumph motorcycle dealership, where Alan Fortas had developed a relationship with the owner, put down as much as I could, signed up for years of payments, and became the owner of a brand-new Triumph Bonneville 750. A few days after I got the Triumph, Elvis took note of it and asked me if he could take it for a ride. He had always been a Harley-Davidson rider and wanted to compare the feel of the rides. He rode around the circle in front of the Perugia house and into Bel Air a little bit, then came back and casually told Alan Fortas that he wanted everybody in the group to have a Triumph Bonneville, and he wanted his guys to have the bikes that night. Alan soon discovered that there were only 3 Bonnevilles at the Robertson lot, and those were in crates, not fully assembled. Alan must have called every Triumph dealer in Southern California, and by midnight we had 9 Bonnevilles being uncrated and assembled in the Perugia front yard. 3 hours later, we had all of them roaring away through the streets of Bel Air. When George Klein came out for a vacation visit and guest DJ'd at KFWB, the #1 rock station in town at the time, he'd send out mysterious dedications to the Bel Air Bonnevilles and then play an Elvis record. The Bel Air Homeowners Society was a little less impressed with us and threatened to have Elvis kicked out of the neighborhood if there was any more late-night rumbling. Elvis's response was to buy a truck and trailer so that all the bikes could be hauled in and out of Bel Air with minimum noise. It occurred to me that I'd spent all I had and put myself into hock to get my bike, and then, because Elvis liked it, everybody else got a free one. But within days, the unfairness of the situation must have occurred to Elvis, too. I got a call from the Robertson lot letting me know that Elvis had paid off my motorcycle. Motorcycle riding became a big part of our L.A. experience, maybe standing in as the West Coast version of our rainbow skating nights. Almost every Sunday, Elvis and a group of 8 to 15 of us would go riding up the Pacific Coast Highway and through the spectacular winding canyon roads of the Santa Monica Mountains. Despite the noise, these were very relaxing rides for everybody, which often ended at a little log cabin market at the top of Topanga Canyon, where we'd stop and drink some Pepsis. But of course, you put Elvis on a motorcycle, and his competitive spirit is going to come out somewhere. He also liked to lead us on these late-night charges up the PCH when the sea air had gotten chilly and the fog was starting to roll in. We had the speedy Triumphs, but he was on a big, rock-steady Harley Electroglide, He'd get the group up to 105 when our front wheels would be shaking enough to scare the hell out of us, and he'd still pass us, nice and easy and all smiles. And no, none of us were ever wearing helmets.
This is the end of the CD. The program continues on the next CD.